The land that refused to let go. The letter trembled in Clara Whitfield's hands, ink still wet from the territorial court's seal. Notice of land dispute. Hale Cattle Company versus Whitfield Homestead. Behind her, 3 pairs of eyes watched from the cabin doorway. Ben, barely 14, Annie, 10, and little Samuel, who didn't understand why his sister's face had gone white as winter snow. Their parents had been dead 8 months. The land they'd worked had no deed, no paper, no proof, just sweat, blood, and a father's promise that hard work would be enough. Victor Hale was about to prove him wrong. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's fight for home can reach. The Montana wind carried more than cold that November morning. It carried endings. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin her father had built with his own hands, watching the horizon where the Bitterroot Mountains cut jagged lines against a sky the color of old bruises. The letter lay on the table behind her, next to the breakfast dishes she hadn't had the strength to clear. Her hands still shook. "Clara?" Ben's voice was careful, the way it had been since they'd buried Ma and Pa beneath the cottonwood tree. "What's it say?" She turned to face them, her siblings, her responsibility, her entire world compressed into 3 frightened faces. Ben tried to look brave, shoulders squared in Pa's old work shirt. Annie clutched the ragdoll Ma had made her, knuckles white. Samuel, only 6, didn't understand why everyone looked so scared, but he felt it anyway. "It says," Clara's throat closed around the words. She swallowed hard, forced them out. "It says someone's claiming our land isn't really ours." "But Pa built this cabin," Ben protested. "He cleared the fields, I know." Clara moved to the table, picked up the letter with steady hands this time. She'd cried all the tears she had in her. Now there was only the cold arithmetic of survival. Pa filed a homestead claim before he died, but he never completed the patent, never got the final deed. "What's that mean?" Annie whispered. It meant everything they knew could be taken. It meant the graves under the cottonwood might be all that remained of the Whitfield name in Montana territory. It meant Clara had been so focused on keeping them fed and warm through their grief that she'd ignored the one thing that could destroy them. "It means we fight," Clara said quietly. She read the letter again, forcing herself to see past the legal language to the threat beneath. Victor Hale, proprietor of the Hale Cattle Company, hereby contests the Whitfield claim to Section 12, Township 8 North, Range 14 West, on grounds of incomplete patent process and lack of continuous occupation during the statutory period. Victor Hale. Even the name sounded like money and power, the kind that rolled over people like Clara the way spring floods rolled over riverbanks. "Ben, you're in charge while I'm gone." Clara was already moving, pulling on her coat, the heavy wool one that had been Pa's. It smelled like wood smoke and leather and memories that made her chest ache. "Keep the fire going. Don't let Samuel outside without his coat. Annie, there's bread dough rising." "Where are you going?" Ben caught her arm, and for a moment she saw the boy he'd been before responsibility aged him. "Clara, you can't go to town alone. The snow." "I have to talk to Mr. Peterson." Harold Peterson was the land agent Bitterroot Junction, the man who'd helped Pa file the original claim. If anyone could explain what this meant, what they could do, it was him. "I'll be back before dark." "Take the rifle," Ben said. Clara looked at her brother, 14 years old and already thinking like a man. She wanted to tell him he didn't have to grow up so fast, that she'd protect them, that everything would be fine. But she'd learned the hard way that promises were luxuries they couldn't afford. "Lock the door behind me," she said instead. Imam. The ride to Bitterroot Junction took 3 hours on their old mare, Molly, who'd seen better days but had hard enough to carry Clara through snow that reached the horse's knees in places. The town sat in a valley where Silver Creek met the Bitterroot River, a collection of false front buildings that served the ranches and homesteads scattered across the territory. Clara tied Molly outside the land office and pushed through the door, bringing cold air and desperation with her. Harold Peterson looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from professional welcome to genuine concern when he recognized her. "Clara, I was hoping you'd come." "You knew about this?" She pulled the letter from her coat, set it on his desk with more force than necessary. You knew Hale was coming after our land? I knew he'd been buying up claims in the valley. Peterson stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He was a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the careful demeanor of someone who dealt in papers and law, not cattle and guns. I didn't know he'd target your family's homestead specifically until yesterday. Why us? We're barely 160 acres. Hale's got thousands. Your land sits between his north and south pastures. He's been consolidating, buying out anyone willing to sell, contesting claims when they won't. Peterson pulled a folder from his cabinet, spread papers across the desk. Your father filed the homestead claim in 1881. According to the law, he needed to prove 5 years of continuous residence and cultivation to receive the final patent. He died in March of this year, 4 years and 7 months after filing. The numbers fell on Clara like stones. 5 months short. Legally, yes. Peterson's voice was gentle. And there's another problem. The law requires the original claimant to complete the process. Since your father is deceased and didn't complete the patent, it's like he never filed at all. Clara sank into the chair across from Peterson's desk. The room tilted slightly, or maybe that was just her world coming apart. We've got nothing. Not nothing. You've got occupation, cultivation, improvements. You've got 4 years of your father's work and 8 months of yours. A judge might consider that. Might. Clara heard the uncertainty in his voice. What are our real chances, Mr. Peterson? Please don't spare me. Peterson removed his spectacles, cleaned them on his vest, a nervous habit Clara recognized as a man buying time before delivering bad news. Victor Hale has the best lawyers in the territory. He's never lost a land dispute. And judges, well, they tend to favor established interests over orphans, Clara finished for him, over people who can't afford to fight. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. She stood, legs steadier than she felt. What do I need to do? Peterson looked at her for a long moment, something like admiration crossing his face. You need a lawyer. You need documented proof of every improvement made to the land. You need witnesses who'll testify to your family's occupation and cultivation. And you need to file a formal contest to Hale's claim before the hearing date. When's the hearing? 3 weeks, territorial court in Helena. 3 weeks to save their lives. Clara nodded slowly. I'll need copies of everything. Pause original filing, the claim map, whatever you've got. Clara, legal representation alone will cost more than most families make in a year. Hale will bury you in motions and delays, and I'll find a way. She met his eyes, saw the doubt there, and felt something hard and fierce kindle in her chest. Mr. Peterson, that land is all we have. It's where my parents are buried. It's where Ben learned to hunt, where Annie planted her garden, where Samuel took his first steps. It's not just acres and cultivation reports. It's our home, and I will not let some cattle baron take it because we're young and poor and alone. Peterson studied her for a moment, then nodded. I'll have the copies ready tomorrow. And Clara, there's a lawyer in Helena, Marcus Webb. He's taken cases against Hale before, never won, but he's honest and he doesn't back down easy. I'll send him a telegram. Let him know you're coming. Thank you. Clara turned to leave, then paused. Mr. Peterson, why are you helping us? Because your father was a good man, because you remind me of my own daughter, because sometimes the law should serve justice, not just power. He smiled sadly. And because I'm old enough that Victor Hale can't hurt me much anymore. The ride home felt longer, colder. Snow began falling in earnest, fat flakes that covered Molly's mane and Clara's shoulders. She let the horse find her own pace, her mind already racing ahead to impossible logistics. A lawyer in Helena meant travel costs, legal fees, time away from the homestead. They had maybe $40 saved, most of it from selling eggs and the vegetables they'd managed to preserve from Annie's garden. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The sun was low when Clara spotted smoke from their chimney, a thin gray line against the darkening sky. Home. The word caught in her throat. For how much longer? She was 50 yards from the cabin when she noticed the horse tied outside, a beautiful bay gelding with silver tack that caught the last light. Not a neighbor's horse. Too fine, too well kept. Claire's hand went to the rifle scabbard Ben had insisted she take. The cabin door opened before she could dismount, and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that cost more than their barn. He was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and eyes that took in everything: Clara, the rifle, the wariness in her posture. "Miss Whitfield?" His voice was deep, educated, not a Montana drawl, but something Eastern, polished. "I apologize for the intrusion. Your brother invited me to wait inside, out of the snow." Clara slid from Molly's back, kept the horse between them. Through the cabin window, she could see Ben standing guard, his hunting rifle visible. Good boy. "Who are you?" "Ethan Hale." The name hit like a fist. Clara's hand tightened on Molly's reins, her mind racing. Hale. Victor Hale's son. The enemy, right here, talking to her siblings, standing in her home. "Get off my land." Her voice came out steady, cold. "Now." Ethan held up his hands, a gesture of peace that Clara didn't believe for a second. "I understand your anger. I'm not here on my father's behalf. I'm here because I don't care why you're here." Clara moved around Molly, putting herself between the stranger and her cabin. "You've got no right to be on this property, talking to my family. Tell your father if he wants to steal our home, he can do it through the courts like the coward he is." Something flickered across Ethan's face. Surprise, maybe? Or pain? "Miss Whitfield, I know about the land dispute. I know my father filed the claim. I also know—" "You know nothing." Clara was shaking now, months of grief and fear and exhaustion boiling over. "You don't know what it's like to bury both parents before you're 20. You don't know what it's like to look at 3 children and wonder how you'll feed them through winter. You don't know what it means to work land until your hands bleed, to build something from nothing, only to have some rich man decide he wants it." "You're right," Ethan said quietly. "I don't know those things, but I know what it's like to watch your father become someone you don't recognize, to see him hurt people and call it business, to be told that power and land matter more than—" He stopped, seemed to gather himself. "I came because I wanted to see this place, to understand what my father is trying to take." "Well, you've seen it. Now leave." "Clara." "Miss Whitfield to you?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Miss Whitfield, I can help you. We don't need help from a Hale. You need help from someone." He gestured to the cabin, the small barn, the fields buried under snow. "You're working this land with 3 children. You've got a legal fight coming that will cost more money than you have. My father has resources, lawyers, connections. He'll crush you if you try to fight him alone." "Then I'll be crushed." Clara stepped closer, close enough to see that his eyes weren't cold like she'd expected, but troubled. "But I'll go down fighting, and I won't betray my family by taking help from the people trying to destroy us. I'm not my father." "No?" Clara laughed, bitter. "You're wearing his name, living off his money. You benefit from every acre he's stolen, every family he's pushed out. Don't stand there and pretend you're different just because you feel guilty about it." The words landed hard. Ethan flinched, and for a moment Clara felt something almost like satisfaction. She wanted to hurt him, wanted him to feel a fraction of the pain his family was causing hers. "You're right," Ethan said finally. "I have benefited from my father's choices. I've lived my whole life on land he took from others. I've eaten food bought with money made from their loss. I can't change that, but I can choose who I am now. I can choose to be better than what I was raised to be." Pretty words. Clara moved toward the cabin. "Take them somewhere else. What if I testified for you?" Clara stopped, turned. "What?" "At the hearing. What if I testified that your family has maintained this land, that you've met the spirit of the homestead law, even if the letter was left incomplete?" Ethan took a step forward, his voice urgent now. "I've seen my father's land claims. I know how he operates. I could help your case." "Why would you do that?" "Because it's right." Clara stared at him, searching for the lie, the manipulation, the hidden angle. But all she saw was a man who looked tired and conflicted and maybe, possibly, sincere. "Your father would disown you. I know. You'd lose everything." "Not everything." Ethan met her eyes. "I'd keep my integrity. That's worth more than land. The cabin door opened and Ben stepped out, rifle still in hand. Clara? Everything all right? Go back inside, Ben. Her brother hesitated, then obeyed. The door closed with a soft thud. Clara looked at Ethan Hale, son of her enemy, stranger offering impossible help, wild card in a game where she'd thought all the rules were fixed. Every instinct screamed not to trust him, but desperation made gamblers of them all. If you testify for us and you're lying, if this is some trick to make us look foolish or desperate, I will spend the rest of my life making sure everyone knows what kind of man you are. Understood. And if you're telling the truth, if you really mean to help us, Clara's throat tightened, then I need to know why. The real reason. Ethan looked past her to the cabin, the barn, the land disappearing into snow and twilight. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost confessional. My mother died when I was 12. Before she passed, she made me promise something. She said there'd come a day when I'd have to choose between what was easy and what was right. She said when that day came, I should think of her and choose right. He met Clara's eyes again. This is that day. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling between them. Clara stood in the cold, weighing truth against lies, hope against cynicism, the tiny chance of an ally against the certain knowledge that Hales destroyed Whitfield's. Come to dinner tomorrow, she heard herself say. Meet my family properly. Let them see who you are. After that, we'll talk about what happens next. Ethan's surprise was almost comical. You're inviting me to dinner? I'm giving you a chance to prove you mean what you say. Don't make me regret it. I won't. He moved toward his horse, then paused. Miss Whitfield, for what it's worth, I think you're one of the bravest people I've ever met. Clara watched him ride away into the gathering dark, wondering if she'd just made the smartest decision of her life or the stupidest. Behind her, the cabin door opened again. Clara? Annie's small voice drifted out. Is that man really going to help us? Clara turned to see all three of her siblings framed in the doorway, firelight warm behind them, fear and hope warring in their faces. She thought about lying, about protecting them from one more disappointment. But they'd earned the truth. I don't know, she said, but tomorrow we're going to find out. Morning brought clear skies and Clara's doubts. She'd spent half the night lying awake, questioning everything. Inviting Ethan Hale to dinner felt like inviting a wolf to guard sheep. But the other half of the night she'd spent doing arithmetic, calculating legal costs, travel expenses, the price of justice when you had nothing to pay with. If Ethan was sincere, he was their best chance. If he was lying, they were already doomed anyway. Annie, set the table with Ma's good dishes. Clara pulled her hair back, tried to look like someone who wasn't terrified. Ben, bring in extra firewood. Samuel, I need you to sweep the floor. Why's everything got to be so fancy? Samuel complained. It's just dinner. It's not just dinner. Ben's voice was serious. It's important. Clara touched his shoulder, grateful. Ben understood stakes without being told. He'd understood since the day they'd laid Ma and Pa in the ground, and Clara had promised them she'd keep the family together, keep them on this land, no matter what. She was trying to keep that promise, even if it meant breaking bread with a Hale. Ethan arrived as the sun began its descent, riding the same bay gelding but looking less polished than yesterday. He'd traded his expensive coat for something simpler, wore work gloves instead of fine leather. When he dismounted, Clara noticed his boots, good quality but worn, actually used for riding rather than show. Miss Whitfield. He nodded to her, then to Ben, who stood on the porch, protective. Thank you for having me. Come in, Clara said. And it's Clara. If we're going to work together, might as well use names. Inside, the cabin smelled like cornbread and stew, humble food, but honest. Clara had made it stretch with extra potatoes, vegetables from the root cellar. It wouldn't impress anyone used to fine dining, but it would fill bellies and show that Whitfields took care of their guests. Ethan stood just inside the door, taking in the single room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A curtain divided off the sleeping area where the children bunked. The furniture was simple. Table and chairs Pa had made, shelves Ben had built, Ma's rocking chair by the fireplace. Everything worn but clean, poor but proud. Your home is lovely, Ethan said, and Clara searched his tone for condescension but found none. It's small. Clara moved to the stove. Ben, help Mr. Hale with his coat. Annie, pour water. Samuel, stop staring. Samuel didn't stop staring. Are you really going to help us, or is this a trick? Samuel! Clara's face flushed, but Ethan laughed, crouched down to Samuel's level. That's a fair question. If I were you, I'd wonder the same thing. The honest answer is yes, I really want to help. And no, it's not a trick. But you don't have to trust me yet. Trust is earned. How you gonna earn it? Samuel demanded. By keeping my promises? By showing up when I say I will. By telling the truth even when it's hard. Ethan glanced at Clara. By being the kind of person your sister doesn't have to worry about. Samuel considered this, then nodded. Okay, but I'm watching you. Good. A man should protect his family. They sat to dinner, an odd assembly around the scarred wooden table. 3 orphaned children, their overwhelmed sister, and the son of the man trying to take everything from them. Clara served stew into mismatched bowls, set cornbread in the center where everyone could reach. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Annie, always the brave one beneath her quiet exterior, asked, "Why does your father want our land?" Ethan didn't dodge the question. Because he can take it. Because he's spent 30 years building an empire and forgotten that every acre has a story, a family, a life attached to it. Because somewhere along the way he stopped seeing people and started seeing only property. Do you see property when you look at us? Ben asked, and Clara heard the edge in his voice. Her brother trying to be a man, trying to protect them the only way he could. No. Ethan met Ben's eyes directly. I see a family fighting to survive. I see courage and resilience and love. I see everything my father's forgotten how to value. Pretty words again, Clara murmured, echoing yesterday. Then let me offer something more concrete. Ethan reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a leather folder. These are copies of my father's correspondence with his lawyers about your land. Letters detailing his strategy, the weaknesses he plans to exploit in your case, the witnesses he'll call to testify against you. Clara's hand froze halfway to her water glass. You're giving us your father's legal strategy? I am. Why? Because you deserve a fair fight. Because the law should serve justice, not just whoever can afford the best lawyers. Ethan slid the folder across the table. And because I meant what I said yesterday, I'm choosing to be better than I was raised to be. Clara opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were letters in elegant script, legal documents, notes in margins. Her father's claim described as abandoned, their family's occupation called sporadic and insufficient, their improvements listed as minimal value. Reading her life reduced to legal ammunition made Clara's blood run cold. He's arguing we abandoned the land when Pa died, she said slowly, processing the strategy. That 8 months without a male head of household means we can't fulfill the homestead requirements. It's his strongest angle, Ethan confirmed. The law presumes a male claimant. My father will argue that without your father alive to complete the patent, the claim died with him. That's not fair, Annie's voice cracked. Clara's worked harder than anybody. She's kept us fed, kept the land going. I know. Ethan's voice was gentle. And that's what we need to prove, that Clara has fulfilled every requirement of the homestead law. The gender shouldn't matter when measuring work and dedication and improvement. Ben leaned forward. You said we need to prove. You're really going to testify for us? If Clara will have me. 3 pairs of eyes turned to Clara. She looked at the folder, at Ethan, at her siblings' desperate hope. This was the moment. Trust him or don't. Gamble everything on a Hale's word or face Victor Hale's lawyers alone. If you testify for us, your father will destroy you, Clara said quietly. You understand that? He'll cut you off, disinherit you, turn every ally against you. You'll lose everything. Not everything that matters. That your family, my family is one man who cares more about land than people. If I lose that, I'm not sure I've lost much. Ethan's jaw tightened. My mother would have helped you without question. She believed land was for living on, not hoarding. If I can't honor her memory by standing with you, then I'm as lost as my father. Clara looked at this man, this contradiction, this Hale who talked like he had a conscience, and made her choice. All right, we work together, but I need your word on something. Name it. If we lose, if your testimony isn't enough and the court sides with your father, you walk away. You don't offer to buy us out. Don't try to make it easier. Don't throw money at us like charity. We go with our dignity intact. Ethan studied her for a long moment. And if we win, then you've kept your promise. Nothing owed, nothing expected. You go back to your life, we go on with ours. Fair enough? Ethan extended his hand across the table. You have my word. Clara took his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, not the soft hands of someone who'd never worked, but the hands of a man who had done his share of hard labor. Maybe there was more to Ethan Hale than his name suggested. Maybe they actually had a chance. Now, Clara released his hand, turned businesslike. Tell me everything in those letters. Every argument, every witness, every dirty trick your father plans to use. If we're going to fight, we're going to fight smart. They talked deep into the evening, voices low over the table while Samuel dozed in Ma's rocking chair and Annie and Ben listened with the intensity of soldiers learning battle strategy. Ethan laid out his father's case piece by piece. The witnesses who'd testify the Whitfields had abandoned the land during the harsh winter after their parents died. The surveyor who'd claimed their fences were in the wrong place. The neighbor Victor had paid off to say he'd never seen improvements being made. He's bought testimony, Ben said, disgusted. Not bought, persuaded. My father's very good at making people believe their interests align with his. Ethan rubbed his face, looking tired. But he's overconfident. He thinks because you're young and poor and alone, you'll crumble under pressure. That's his weakness. And our strength? Clara asked. Truth. You've lived every day of that homestead law. You've proved up the land with blood and sweat. You've got a story that matters. Ethan looked around the table at each face in turn. And you've got each other. My father's forgotten what that means, but a jury won't. Neither will a judge if we present this right. We need Marcus Webb, Clara said, making the decision. Mr. Peterson said he's honest, doesn't back down. If we're going to Helena, we need a real lawyer. I can cover his fees, Ethan offered. No, Clara's voice was firm. We're not taking your money. We'll find a way to pay. Clara, I mean it. I'll sell everything we don't absolutely need. I'll take on work, borrow against next year's harvest, whatever it takes. But we're not beholden to anyone, especially not a Hale. Ethan looked like he wanted to argue, then nodded slowly. All right, but let me write to Webb, explain the case, encourage him to take it. My name might hurt in some ways, but in this instance, it might convince him the fight is worth taking. Why would your name convince him? Because Marcus Webb hates my father almost as much as you do. He's lost cases to Victor's lawyers, seen families destroyed by Hale Cattle Company expansion. If I'm willing to testify against my own father, Webb will know this is different. He'll know there's a real chance to win. Clara considered this, weighed pride against pragmatism. Fine. Write to Webb, but make it clear we're paying clients, not charity cases. Understood. The clock on the mantel chimed 9, and Ethan stood. I should go. It's a long ride back, and I've taken enough of your evening. Clara walked him to the door while Ben gathered the dinner dishes and Annie carried Samuel to bed. Outside, the temperature had dropped, stars sharp and bright in a clear sky. Thank you, Clara said quietly, for the letters, for your honesty, for this. Don't thank me yet. We haven't won. No. But for the first time since I got that letter from the territorial court, I don't feel alone in this fight. She met his eyes. That means something. Ethan smiled, and Clara was struck by how it transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened. Your father would be proud of you, the way you're fighting for your family, your home. That takes more courage than most people ever find. I don't feel very courageous. Mostly I feel terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite it. Ethan swung up onto his horse, gathered the reins. I'll send that letter to Webb tonight, and I'll start documenting everything I can from my father's records. Anything that might help your case. Be careful. If your father finds out what you're doing, let me worry about my father. You focus on yours, on honoring his memory by keeping this land in your family where it belongs. Clara watched him ride into the darkness, his horse's hoofbeats fading into silence. Behind her, the cabin glowed warm with lamplight. Inside, Ben was teaching Annie a card game by the fire. Samuel slept peacefully. Home. Family. Everything worth fighting for. She stepped back inside, closed the door against the cold, and began to plan for war. The letter from Marcus Webb arrived 6 days later, carried by a rider who'd braved early winter storms to reach Bitterroot Junction. Clara stood in Peterson's office, hands trembling as she broke the seal. "Miss Whitfield," the letter began in strong, slanted script. "Ethan Hale's correspondence reached me with claims so extraordinary I felt compelled to verify them personally. A Hale testifying against Hale Cattle Company represents either the most elaborate deception I've encountered in 20 years of law or a genuine crisis of conscience worth supporting. I'm inclined toward the latter. I will represent your family. My fee is $200, payable when and if we win your case. If we lose, you owe me nothing but the satisfaction of having fought Victor Hale with everything I have. I've lost to that man too many times. Perhaps this time the outcome will be different. I'll arrive in Bitterroot Junction on the 18th to prepare our case. In the meantime, document everything, every fence post your father set, every field cleared, every improvement made. The law may favor men and money, but juries still respond to truth when it's presented well enough. Respectfully, Marcus Webb, attorney at law." "He took the case," Clara whispered, reading it twice to be certain. "He's really taking our case." Peterson smiled from behind his desk, genuine warmth in his expression. "Webb's a good man, stubborn as they come, which is exactly what you need against Victor Hale." He paused, studying Clara's face. "You understand this won't be easy? Hale will come at you with everything. He'll question your father's character, your capability to manage a homestead, your siblings' welfare. He'll make you prove every single day you've lived on that land." "Let him try." Clara folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her coat pocket next to her heart. "We've got nothing to hide and everything to fight for. That makes us dangerous." "It makes you brave. There's a difference." Peterson pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, dipped his pen. "Now, let's start making lists. Every neighbor who can testify to your family's presence on that land, every merchant who sold your father's supplies, every person who attended your parents' burial. We need witnesses, Clara, good, credible people who'll stand up in court and tell the truth." They worked through the afternoon, Clara's memory reaching back through 4 years of frontier life. The Johnsons, who'd helped raise the barn. Mrs. Chen from the general store, who'd extended credit when times were lean. Reverend Matthews, who'd presided over both her parents' wedding and their funeral. Names accumulated on Peterson's list, a community Clara hadn't fully appreciated until now, when she needed them most. "Will they testify?" she asked quietly. "Against Victor Hale? He could make things difficult for anyone who speaks against him." "Some will be afraid. That's human nature." Peterson set down his pen, met her eyes. "But some will be angry. Some will remember when Hale pushed out the Hendersons or bought the Miller claim for half what it was worth. Some will see in your fight a chance to push back against a man who's accumulated too much power. You might be surprised who stands with you." Clara rode home as daylight failed, her mind full of strategy and possibility. The mare picked her way through snow with patient familiarity, and Clara let her thoughts drift to Ethan Hale, the wild card in this impossible gamble. She'd seen him twice more since that first dinner, both times at his insistence on helping repair winter damage to the cabin. He'd arrived with tools and lumber, worked alongside Ben to patch the roof where wind had torn shingles loose, reinforced the barn door that had warped in the cold. He worked like a man who knew labor, not like some gentleman playing at frontier life. His hands blistered the first day, bled the second, but he never complained. Samuel had taken to following him around, asking endless questions about horses and building and what it was like to live in a big ranch house. Ethan answered everything with patience Clara wouldn't have expected from someone raised in wealth. "Maybe he's not like his father," Annie had said yesterday, watching Ethan teach Ben how to properly set a fence post. Maybe people can be different than how they're raised. Clara wanted to believe that, but trust was expensive, and she'd already gambled more than she could afford to lose. The cabin came into view, smoke rising from the chimney into a sky going purple with dusk. Clara was 20 yards from the barn when she noticed the second horse tied outside. Not Ethan's bay, but a roan mare she didn't recognize. Her hand moved instinctively toward the rifle, then froze when the cabin door opened and a woman stepped out. She was perhaps 50, dressed in practical wool with a fur-lined coat that spoke of money, but not ostentation. Her face was weathered by sun and wind, her eyes sharp and assessing as they took in Clara's approach. "Miss Whitfield?" The woman's voice carried authority softened by something like kindness. "I'm Margaret Thornton. I own the ranch east of the Hale property. Might I have a word?" Clara dismounted slowly, wariness prickling along her spine. "What brings you here, Mrs. Thornton?" "The same thing that's brought half the valley to attention. You're fighting Victor Hale in court, and that boy of his is helping you do it." Margaret's eyes gleamed with something between amusement and respect. "I had to see for myself the woman who convinced Ethan Hale to betray his father's empire." "I didn't convince him of anything. He made his own choice." "Even more interesting." Margaret glanced toward the cabin, where Claire could see Annie and Samuel peering through the window. "May we speak inside? It's damned cold out here, and what I have to say shouldn't be shared with the wind." Ben appeared in the doorway, protective and uncertain. Clara nodded to him. "It's all right," and led Margaret Thornton into the warmth of their small home. Inside, Margaret declined tea but accepted the chair by the fire, settling into it with the ease of someone accustomed to making herself comfortable anywhere. She studied the cabin with frank interest, the worn furniture, the children's drawings tacked to the wall, the shelf of books that had been Ma's pride. "Your mother taught you to read," Margaret said, not quite a question. "She was a school teacher before she married Pa. She believed education mattered, even out here." Clara stood near the stove, arms crossed. "Mrs. Thornton, why are you here?" "Direct. I like that." Margaret leaned back, firelight playing across her weathered features. "I'm here because I lost my husband's ranch to Victor Hale 15 years ago. He found a flaw in our land patent, bought our debt from the bank, and squeezed us until we had no choice but to sell. I've spent every year since building a new ranch, making sure I never give that man another opportunity to take what's mine." Clara's breath caught. "You're testifying against him. That's why you came." "I'm considering it, but I need to know you're serious about this fight, that you won't fold when Hale's lawyers start tearing into you, that you won't take a settlement and run." Margaret's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Because if I testify, if I put my name on record against Victor Hale, he'll come after me again. He'll look for weaknesses, for leverage, for any way to punish me. I need to know you're worth that risk." The words should have stung, but Clara understood the calculation behind them. Margaret Thornton had survived losing everything once. She wouldn't risk it again for someone who'd quit halfway through. "Mrs. Thornton, this land is all my siblings and I have left of our parents. It's where they're buried, where we've built our lives, where we belong." Clara moved to the window, looked out at fields sleeping under snow. "Victor Hale thinks he can take it because we're young and poor and alone. He thinks the law will side with money and power over work and truth. Maybe he's right. Maybe we'll lose everything, but I won't surrender without fighting, and I won't abandon this homestead while there's breath in my body to defend it." Pretty speech, but words are cheap when you're not standing in a courtroom being eviscerated by lawyers. Clara turned back to face her. "Then let me ask you something, Mrs. Thornton. When Hale took your ranch, when you lost everything you and your husband built, did you wish someone had fought harder? Did you wish you'd had allies who refused to back down?" Margaret's expression shifted, something old and painful crossing her face. "Every damn day." "Then help us be what you needed 15 years ago. Help us prove that people like Victor Hale don't always win. Help us show that sometimes truth matters more than money." Clara's voice dropped, fierce and urgent. "And if we lose, at least we'll lose knowing we tried everything, used every resource, fought with everyone who had the courage to stand with us." Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the fire's crackle and Samuel's whispered question to Annie. "What's happening?" Margaret Thornton stood slowly, moved to where Clara waited by the window. Up close, Clara could see the lines carved deep around her eyes, the silver threading her hair, the hard-won strength of someone who'd survived what should have broken her. "You remind me of myself at your age. Stubborn, brave, Too damn proud for your own good." Margaret smiled, and it transformed her stern features. "I'll testify. I'll tell the court exactly how Victor Hale operates, what he did to my family, why his claim on your land is just another chapter in 30 years of theft, and I'll dare him to come after me again." Claire's knees went weak with relief. "Thank you. Mrs. Thornton, you don't know what this means. I know exactly what it means. It means I'm finally doing what I should have done 15 years ago, fighting back." Margaret gripped Clara's shoulder, her hand strong and sure. "But you need to understand something, girl. Testimony from me will enrage Victor. He'll see it as a personal betrayal, an old enemy rising up when he thought I was beaten. He'll come at you twice as hard to punish us both." "Let him come. We'll be ready." "Good." Margaret moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. Ethan Hale, the boy helping you, he's not playing at this, is he? He's genuinely standing against his father? He gave us his father's legal strategy. He's planning to testify for us. He's worked on our land, earned my siblings' trust, put everything on the line." Clara hesitated, then added, "I don't fully understand why, but I believe he means what he says. His mother was a good woman. Elizabeth Hale had a conscience her husband lacked. She used to visit my ranch before—" Margaret's voice caught. "Before we lost it. She tried to convince Victor to withdraw his claim, said it wasn't right to take advantage of a widow's grief. He ignored her." She looked at Clara with something like hope. "Maybe Ethan inherited his mother's heart instead of his father's ambition. Maybe there's more of Elizabeth in that boy than Victor ever realized." After Margaret left, Clara stood in the doorway watching her ride into gathering darkness. Two allies now, Ethan Hale and Margaret Thornton, both motivated by ghosts and conscience. It wasn't much against Victor Hale's empire, but it was more than they'd had a week ago. "Clara?" Ben touched her arm, his voice quiet. "Are we really going to win this?" She wanted to say yes, wanted to promise him that everything would be fine, that justice would prevail, that hard work and truth would triumph over money and corruption. But she'd promised herself no more lies to her siblings, no matter how comforting. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but we're going to fight like we can. That's all anyone can do." The next morning brought Ethan, arriving early with a wagon full of supplies, lumber, nails, tar paper for the roof, and a side of beef that made Annie gasp. "What's all this?" Clara asked, suspicious even as her stomach growled at the sight of fresh meat. "Supplies for winter. And before you refuse, they're not charity, they're payment." Ethan climbed down from the wagon, his breath fogging in cold air. "I'm going to be spending a lot of time here over the next 2 weeks, helping you document every improvement on this land. The least you can do is feed me and put me to work while I'm here." "Payment for what? You're helping us. And you're letting me be part of something that matters. Trust me, that's worth more than beef and lumber." Ethan began unloading boards, stacking them near the barn. "Besides, if we're going to prove this homestead meets every requirement of the law, we need to make sure it actually does. That barn door needs rehinging. The chicken coop needs reinforcement. The fence line on the South 40 could use shoring up." Ben appeared from the barn, took in the supplies with wide eyes. "Mr. Hale, this is too much." "It's Ethan, and it's not too much if we're going to win this case." He met Clara's gaze over the wagon bed. "Your lawyer arrives in 4 days. When Marcus Webb gets here, I want him to see a homestead that's undeniably well-maintained, undeniably lived on, undeniably yours. Let me help make that happen." Clara studied him, this man who kept showing up, kept working, kept giving pieces of himself to their cause. She thought about Margaret Thornton's words, about Elizabeth Hale's conscience living on in her son. "All right," she said finally. "But we work together. No charity, no handouts. You labor, we labor. Fair exchange." "Fair exchange," Ethan agreed. They fell into a rhythm over the following days, a strange partnership born of necessity and growing into something that felt almost like friendship. Ethan worked alongside Ben, teaching him techniques for setting posts that would last through Montana winters. He showed Annie how to reinforce the chicken coop against foxes and weather. He even won over Samuel completely by carving him a wooden horse during lunch breaks, the kind of toy the boy had never owned. Clara watched it all with conflicting emotions. Part of her remained wary, waiting for the betrayal she'd been taught to expect from men with power. But another part, smaller, more hopeful, began to see Ethan as something more than his name. He laughed at Samuel's jokes. He listened when Annie talked about her garden plans for spring. He treated Ben like an equal, not a child playing at being a man. And when he looked at Clara, his eyes held something she couldn't quite name, respect, maybe, or admiration. Possibly something deeper she wasn't ready to examine. On the third day, while they were repairing fence line in the south pasture, Ethan broke the comfortable silence they'd been working in. "Margaret Thornton came to see you." Clara's hammer paused mid-swing. "How did you know that?" "I saw her horse when I was riding out 2 nights ago. Recognized the roan mare. Margaret's partial to that breed." He drove a nail with practiced efficiency. "Did she agree to testify?" "She did. She told me about losing her ranch to your father." Ethan's jaw tightened. "The Thornton case was the first time I questioned what my father did. I was 10 years old, and I heard him laughing about how easy it had been to find the flaw in their patent, how the widow had cried when they signed over the deed." He looked at Clara, pain raw in his eyes. "I asked my mother if what he'd done was right. She said no. Said sometimes good people do bad things when they forget land belongs to the people who love it, not just the people who own it." "What did your father say when you asked him?" "He said sentiment was a luxury we couldn't afford, that the cattle business required hard decisions, and only the strong survived." Ethan returned to hammering, each strike harder than necessary. I wanted to believe him, wanted to think there was honor in what we were building. But every year there were more families like the Thorntons, more land absorbed into Hale Holdings, more people displaced by my father's ambition. Clara set down her hammer, faced him fully. "Why did you stay? If you disagreed with him, if you saw what he was doing, why didn't you leave?" "Because I kept thinking I could change him. That if I worked hard enough, proved myself valuable enough, earned the right to be heard, maybe he'd listen. Maybe he'd see that we had enough land, enough cattle, enough empire." Ethan's laugh was bitter. "I was naive. My father doesn't want enough. He wants everything. And now you're helping us take something away from him. Now I'm helping you keep something that was never his to take." Ethan met her gaze, and Clara saw determination there, fierce and unwavering. "My mother made me promise to choose right over easy. This is the rightest thing I've ever done, even if it costs me everything." They worked in silence after that, but it was a different quality of quiet, understanding, shared purpose. 2 people on the same side of an impossible fight. That evening, after Ethan had left and the children were preparing for bed, Ben pulled Clara aside. "He's in love with you," her brother said bluntly. Clara nearly dropped the dish she was washing. "What?" "Ben, that's—" "I've got eyes, Clara. I see how he looks at you when you're not paying attention, like you're the bravest person he's ever met, like he'd do anything to protect you." Ben's voice was serious, older than his 14 years. "I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying you should know. He's helping us because it's the right thing to do, because of his mother's memory. Not because it can be both things." Ben touched her arm, his expression gentle. "Pa used to look at Ma that way, like she was the center of everything that mattered. Ethan looks at you the same." Clara stood at the wash basin long after Ben went to bed, her hands in cooling water, her mind churning. She couldn't afford complications, couldn't let herself think about Ethan as anything other than an ally in their legal battle. Getting attached to a Hale, even one who seemed different, that was a luxury more dangerous than anything his father could throw at them. But lying in her narrow bed that night, listening to Annie's soft breathing and Samuel's occasional sleep murmurs, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the way Ethan had carved that wooden horse for her brother. The gentleness in his hands as he'd worked, the patience in his voice when teaching, the quiet certainty in his eyes when he'd promised to stand with them, no matter the cost. Maybe Ben was right. Maybe it could be both things, doing what was right and feeling something more complicated than gratitude. Clara pushed the thought away and focused on what mattered. Marcus Webb would arrive tomorrow. They had 4 days to prepare before traveling to Helena for the hearing. Everything else, feelings, possibilities, what-ifs, would have to wait until after they'd fought for their home, if there was an after. if they survived what was coming. Marcus Webb arrived on schedule, riding a sturdy buckskin gelding and carrying a leather case stuffed with papers. He was younger than Clara expected, maybe 40, with sandy hair going gray at the temples and eyes that missed nothing. He dismounted in front of the cabin with the efficiency of a man who'd spent years traveling circuit courts across rough territory. "Miss Whitfield." His handshake was firm, brief. "Marcus Webb, let's see what we're working with." For the next 2 days, Webb turned their lives inside out. He interviewed each child separately, asking detailed questions about their daily routines, their memories of their parents, what work they'd done on the land. He walked every acre of the homestead, making notes about fences, fields, improvements. He studied the barn, the cabin, the root cellar, measuring and documenting with meticulous precision. Ethan arrived midway through the first day and was immediately subjected to Webb's interrogation. "You understand what you're risking," Webb said, not a question. "Testifying against your father in a land dispute will destroy your relationship with him, possibly permanently." "I understand." "You'll be cross-examined by the best lawyers in Montana Territory. They'll try to make you look like a traitor, a fool, or both. They'll question your motives, your character, your sanity for turning on your own family." "I'm prepared for that." Webb studied Ethan with the intensity of a man who'd learned not to trust easy answers. "Why are you doing this? And don't give me noble sentiment. I need the truth." Ethan glanced at Clara, then back to Webb. "Because my father is wrong. Because the Whitfields have earned this land through work and sacrifice, and taking it from them is theft no matter what the law might technically allow. Because I'm tired of being complicit in an empire built on other people's loss." He straightened, met Webb's hard gaze directly. "And because if I don't stand for something now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what kind of man I could have been if I'd had courage when it mattered." Webb was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That'll do. That kind of honesty. That's what wins cases when the law isn't clearly on our side." That evening, Webb gathered them around the dinner table: Clara, her siblings, Ethan, and Margaret Thornton, who'd returned at Webb's request. "Here's where we stand," Webb began, spreading papers across the scarred wood. "Victor Hale has a strong technical case. The homestead law requires the original claimant to complete the patent process. Your father died before doing so, which gives Hale's lawyers grounds to argue the claim is invalid." "But Clara's maintained everything," Ben protested. "She's done all the work." "I know. And that's our argument. We need to prove that the spirit of the homestead law has been fulfilled, even if the letter was interrupted by tragedy." Webb looked at each of them in turn. "We're going to tell your family's story. Every detail, every hardship, every choice Clara made to keep you together and keep this land productive. We're going to make that judge and jury see you as people, not just names on a legal document." "What about my testimony?" Margaret asked. "You establish pattern and motive. You show that Victor Hale has done this before, found technical flaws to seize land from vulnerable families. You prove this isn't about legitimate land claims, but about expansion and power." Webb turned to Ethan. "And you provide the most powerful testimony of all. A son willing to stand against his father for what's right carries weight no outside witness can match." "Will it be enough?" Clara's voice was quiet. Webb didn't sugarcoat it. "I don't know. We're fighting uphill against money, influence, and a legal system that favors men and established interests. But we've got truth on our side, and that counts for something. Sometimes it counts for everything." They worked late into the night, Webb coaching them on testimony, preparing them for the questions they'd face. When Ethan finally left, Clara walked him to his horse under a sky brilliant with stars. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly. "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of my father's anger, but of failing you. Of not being convincing enough, strong enough, good enough to help you win. You've already given us more than we had any right to expect. I want to give you everything." The words came out raw, unguarded, and Ethan seemed to realize what he'd said. "I mean, I want your family to win, to keep this land, to have the life you deserve." Clara looked at him in the starlight, this complicated man who'd walked away from empire to stand with orphans fighting for survival. Ben's words echoed in her mind. "He's in love with you. And for the first time, she let herself consider that maybe her brother was right. "Ethan, you don't have to say anything." He swung up onto his horse, looked down at her with something that might have been longing or might have been goodbye. "Let's win this case first. Everything else can wait." He rode into darkness, leaving Clara standing in the cold, her heart doing complicated things she didn't have time to examine. The day before they left for Helena, a writer brought a message from Victor Hale himself. Clara read it with shaking hands. "Miss Whitfield, I understand you've retained legal counsel to contest my rightful claim to Section 12. I'm prepared to offer a generous settlement, $300, and safe passage to wherever you wish to relocate your family. This is more than fair compensation for an invalid claim. I suggest you accept before this matter becomes uglier than necessary." Victor Hale. $300. More money than they'd seen in years. Enough to start over somewhere else, to avoid the pain and risk of a court battle they might lose anyway. Clara read it twice, then walked to the stove and fed it to the flames. "What was that?" Annie asked. "Nothing important," Clara said, watching the paper curl and blacken. "Just someone who doesn't understand that home isn't for sale." Tomorrow, they'd leave for Helena. Tomorrow, they'd begin the fight that would determine everything. But tonight, Clara stood in the cabin her father built, surrounded by her siblings and the evidence of all they'd survived, and knew with absolute certainty that some things were worth more than safety or money or easy answers. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The journey to Helena took 2 days through country that grew steadily colder as they climbed toward the territorial capital. Clara rode in the wagon Webb had hired, Ben beside her handling the reins with newfound confidence, while Annie and Samuel huddled under blankets in the back. Margaret Thornton rode alongside on her roan mare, and Ethan followed at a distance, close enough to help if needed, far enough to avoid the appearance of impropriety that might hurt their case. They spent the first night in a roadhouse halfway to Helena, a rough establishment that charged too much for thin soup and hard beds. Clara lay awake listening to Annie's breathing, her mind running through everything Webb had drilled into her. Answer questions directly. Don't volunteer information. Meet the judge's eyes. Show respect, but not deference. Remember you're fighting for your family, not begging for mercy. The words circled endlessly, mixing with fear and determination until Clara couldn't separate one from the other. Morning brought freezing rain that turned the road treacherous. They traveled slowly, the wagon wheels slipping in mud that tried to suck them down. By the time Helena's buildings appeared through the gray curtain of weather, Clara's hands were numb from gripping the wagon seat, and her back ached from tension that wouldn't ease. Helena sprawled across gulches and hillsides, a city built on gold strikes and territorial ambition. The streets churned with miners, merchants, lawyers, politicians, all the machinery of commerce and law that seemed impossibly distant from the quiet rhythms of homestead life. Clara felt small here, out of place, a frontier woman in a borrowed dress entering a world that belonged to men like Victor Hale. Webb had secured them rooms in a modest hotel near the courthouse, nothing fancy but clean and warm. As Clara helped Annie and Samuel settle in, she caught sight of herself in the mirror, pale, exhausted, her best dress wrinkled from travel. She looked like what she was, a 20-year-old woman trying to hold together a family and a homestead with nothing but stubbornness and desperation. "You look fine," Margaret said from the doorway, reading Clara's thoughts. "You look like someone who's worked for everything she has. That's exactly how you should look." The hearing was set for 10 o'clock the next morning. Webb spent the evening reviewing testimony one final time, his questions sharp and unforgiving. "They'll ask why you didn't complete the patent after your father died. What do you say?" Clara took a breath, centered herself. "I was 19 years old, orphaned, responsible for 3 children. My priority was keeping us fed and warm through winter. I didn't understand the legal requirements or that time was running out. They'll say ignorance of the law is no excuse. And I'll say that survival took precedence over paperwork. That I was doing the work of the homestead law even if I didn't understand the bureaucracy behind it." Webb nodded, moved to Ben. "They'll ask if Clara can manage a homestead alone. What do you tell them?" "That she already has, that she's run our place for 8 months, brought in a harvest, maintained livestock. kept us together when we had every reason to fall apart. Ben's voice was steady, older than his years. That being a woman doesn't make her less capable, just less recognized. Good. Don't embellish, don't exaggerate. Simple truth is our strongest weapon. Webb turned to Ethan, his expression hardening. You'll face the worst of it. Hale's lawyers will tear into you. They'll call you ungrateful, delusional, a traitor to your family. They'll suggest Clara seduced you, that you're emotionally compromised, that your testimony can't be trusted. How do you respond? Ethan met Webb's gaze without flinching. I tell the truth, that I came to see the Whitfield homestead with my own eyes, expecting to find the abandoned claim my father described. Instead, I found a family working harder than anyone I'd known, maintaining land through grief and hardship, embodying everything the homestead law was meant to encourage. I tell them my testimony isn't about Clara Whitfield personally. It's about what's right and what's theft. And when they ask about your relationship with Miss Whitfield, I'll say she's someone I respect enormously, someone who's shown me what real courage looks like, someone whose fight for her family has made me question everything I thought I knew about land and ownership and justice. Ethan's voice dropped. And I'll say that none of that changes the facts of the case. The Whitfields have earned this land. My personal feelings don't alter that truth. Webb studied him for a long moment, then nodded. That'll work. Honesty usually does, when a man has the spine to deliver it. They broke for the night, but Clara couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of the small room she shared with Annie, watching Helena's lights flicker through rain. Somewhere in this city, Victor Hale was preparing his own case, marshaling resources and influence Clara couldn't match. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt only a strange calm settling over her shoulders like a familiar coat. This was it. Tomorrow, everything would be decided. Either they'd walk out of that courthouse with their home secured, or they'd walk out with nothing but the dignity of having fought. Either way, Clara had kept her promise to her parents. She'd protected her siblings, defended their land, refused to surrender without making Victor Hale work for every inch he tried to take. Behind her, Annie stirred in sleep, murmuring something about gardens and spring planting. Clara turned from the window, tucked the blanket more securely around her sister's shoulders, and let herself imagine, just for a moment, a future where those gardens actually grew. The territorial courthouse was an imposing brick building that spoke of order and authority, of law carved in stone rather than negotiated in mud. Clara climbed the steps with Webb beside her, Margaret and her siblings following. Ethan had arrived separately, keeping his distance until the hearing began. Professional witnesses didn't socialize with the families they testified for, Webb had explained. Appearances mattered in court, sometimes more than facts. Inside, the hallway echoed with footsteps and low voices, lawyers conferring with clients, witnesses waiting to be called. Clara recognized some faces from the valley, neighbors who'd come to watch, merchants who'd dealt with both Whitfields and Hales, the surveyor her father had hired to mark their original claim. The sight of familiar faces steadied her. She wasn't alone in this, not really. A community had gathered to bear witness, regardless of the outcome. Then she saw Victor Hale. He stood at the far end of the hallway, surrounded by three men in expensive suits, his legal team clearly. Hale himself was tall, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to deference. His clothes were perfectly tailored, his boots polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him radiated power and certainty, the absolute conviction that he would win because he always won. His eyes found Clara across the crowded hallway, and something cold passed between them. This was personal for him too, she realized, not because he cared about their specific acres, but because someone was challenging him. Because a poor orphaned woman had dared to say no to Victor Hale, and that defiance itself was intolerable. Don't look at him, Webb murmured. Don't give him the satisfaction of seeing fear. Clara lifted her chin, met Hale's gaze with all the courage she could gather, and didn't look away until he did. The courtroom was smaller than Clara expected, paneled in dark wood with high windows that let in weak winter light. The judge's bench dominated the front, flanked by the territorial seal and an American flag. Rows of wooden benches filled the gallery, already packed with spectators drawn by the novelty of a Hale family member testifying against Hale Cattle Company. Judge Aldrich entered precisely at 10, a stern-faced man in his 60s who'd presided over territorial courts for 20 years. He surveyed the packed courtroom with obvious displeasure. "This is a hearing on a land dispute, not a circus," he announced, his voice carrying authority that silenced the murmuring crowd. "I'll have order and decorum, or I'll clear this courtroom. Is that understood?" The crowd settled into respectful silence. Aldrich took his seat, adjusted his spectacles, and reviewed the papers before him. Hale versus Whitfield, case number 447. "Mr. Morrison, you're representing the plaintiff." One of Victor Hale's lawyers stood, a silver-haired man with the smooth confidence of someone who'd never lost an argument he cared about. "Yes, Your Honor. Edmund Morrison for Victor Hale and Hale Cattle Company." "Mr. Webb for the defense?" Webb rose, less polished but steady. "Marcus Webb representing Clara Whitfield and family, Your Honor." "Very well. Mr. Morrison, present your case." Morrison's opening was everything Clara had feared: articulate, precise, devastating. He laid out the facts with clinical efficiency. James Whitfield had filed a homestead claim in 1881. The law required 5 years of continuous residence and cultivation, culminating in a final patent. James Whitfield had died in March 1885, 5 months short of the required period. No final patent had been issued. Therefore, the claim was incomplete and the land had reverted to public domain, available for claim by any qualified party, including Victor Hale. "The law is clear, Your Honor," Morrison concluded. "Sentiment and hardship, while regrettable, do not override legal requirements. Miss Whitfield and her siblings are not the legal claimants to this land. They are, legally speaking, squatters on public domain that my client has properly claimed through territorial procedures." The word squatters landed like a slap. Clara felt Ben stiffen beside her, heard Annie's small gasp. Webb's hand on her shoulder was steady. "Stay calm. Don't react." "Mr. Webb, your response?" Webb stood, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of Morrison's polish, but twice the conviction. "Your Honor, the law exists to serve justice, not to create it through technicality. The homestead law was written to encourage settlement, to reward families who improved raw land through labor and dedication. The Whitfield family has done exactly that. 4 years of James Whitfield's work, followed by 8 months of his daughter's stewardship, continuous occupation, continuous improvement, continuous fulfillment of every requirement the homestead law was meant to measure." "Every requirement except completion of the patent," Morrison interjected. "A technicality made impossible by tragedy," Webb shot back. "James Whitfield couldn't complete the process because he died. His daughter couldn't complete it because she was 19 years old, orphaned, and focused on survival rather than bureaucracy. The law may have been written with male claimants in mind, but it doesn't, or shouldn't, punish families for the death of a father or the gender of his successor." Judge Aldrich leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Webb, are you arguing that Miss Whitfield should be allowed to complete the patent in her father's stead?" "I'm arguing that the patent should be granted based on the work already completed, that the 5-year requirement has been effectively met through combined family occupation and improvement, that denying this claim based solely on Mr. Whitfield's untimely death violates the spirit and purpose of the homestead law." "And I'm arguing that the law says what it says," Morrison countered. "We can't rewrite statutes based on sympathetic circumstances. If we excuse the Whitfields from completing the required 5 years, we set a precedent that undermines the entire homestead system." The arguments went back and forth, technical and passionate by turns, while Clara sat rigid on the hard wooden bench and tried to breathe. This was her life being dissected, reduced to legal theory and statutory interpretation. Everything her family had built, everything they'd survived, rendered down to whether technicality outweighed truth. "I'll hear testimony," Judge Aldrich said finally. "Mr. Morrison, call your first witness." Morrison called the surveyor who'd mapped the original claim, a thin man named Douglas, who testified that James Whitfield's markers had been imprecise, possibly encroaching on adjacent public land. Webb's cross-examination dismantled that quickly enough. The imprecision was minor, within acceptable margins, and regardless didn't affect whether the family had occupied the land. Next came a neighbor, a man named Garrett, who owned property south of the Whitfield homestead. Under Morrison's questioning, he testified that he'd seen the Whitfield place looking abandoned during the winter after their parents died. "Abandoned how?" Morrison pressed. No smoke from the chimney some days, no activity in the fields. Looked like nobody was living there. Webb stood for cross-examination, his voice sharp. Mr. Garrett, how often did you actually visit the Whitfield property that winter? Didn't visit. Saw it from my land. How far is your land from the Whitfield cabin? Garrett shifted uncomfortably. Mile, maybe. A mile. And from a mile away, in winter, you determined the property was abandoned because you didn't see smoke on certain days? Well, it looked... Mr. Garrett, do you know that the Whitfield children attended school 3 days a week that winter? That Clara Whitfield was often in town selling eggs and preserved vegetables? That the family was inside their home, conserving firewood, on the days you happened to glance over from a mile away? I just know what I saw. You know what you assumed, Webb corrected. No further questions. The testimony continued through the morning, Morrison calling witnesses who painted the Whitfields as struggling, barely maintaining the land, while Webb systematically showed that struggle and maintenance weren't mutually exclusive. Clara watched it unfold like a battle fought with words instead of weapons, each side landing blows, neither achieving knockout victory. Then Morrison called his key witness, a lawyer named Patterson who specialized in land law. Patterson testified at length about homestead requirements, about the legal necessity of completing the full 5-year period, about the impossibility of transferring an incomplete claim to heirs who weren't original claimants. In your professional opinion, Morrison asked, does Miss Whitfield have any legal standing to complete her father's homestead claim? No, Patterson said flatly. The law requires the original claimant to complete the process. Mr. Whitfield's death ended that possibility. The claim died with him. Webb's cross-examination was brief but pointed. Mr. Patterson, has the homestead law ever been tested in cases of claimant death before patent completion? There have been few such cases. Few, meaning almost none. Meaning this is largely uncharted legal territory where precedent hasn't been firmly established. The statute is clear. The statute was written presuming claimants would live long enough to complete the process. It doesn't explicitly address succession in cases of death, does it? Patterson hesitated. Not explicitly, no. So your opinion, while learned, is interpretation rather than settled law. All legal analysis involves interpretation. Thank you, Mr. Patterson. That's exactly my point. The morning session ended with Morrison resting his case. Judge Aldrich called a recess for lunch, and Clara followed Webb out of the courtroom on shaking legs. We're holding our own, Webb said quietly as they walked to a nearby cafe. Morrison's case is strong on technicality, but weak on justice. If we can make the judge see that, if our testimony resonates, we've got a chance. What kind of chance? Clara needed numbers, percentages, something concrete to hold on to. Webb met her eyes, honest as always. 40% maybe. Better than we started with, not as good as I'd like. Everything depends on our witnesses now, on whether we can make them see you as people rather than just names in a legal dispute. 40%. Less than half. Clara forced down soup she couldn't taste and tried not to think about what 60% chance of losing actually meant. The afternoon session began with Webb calling his witnesses. First came Peterson, the land agent, who testified to James Whitfield's diligence in filing proper claims, to the family's reputation for hard work, to Clara's visits seeking guidance on completing the patent process. She didn't know the legal requirements? Morrison asked on cross-examination. She was learning them. She came to my office multiple times, asking questions, trying to understand the process. That's not abandonment. That's a young woman trying to navigate complex bureaucracy while keeping her family fed. Margaret Thornton followed, her testimony sharp and damning. She described losing her own ranch to Victor Hale 15 years earlier, the technicalities he'd exploited, the pattern of using legal mechanisms to seize land from vulnerable families. Morrison objected repeatedly, calling it character assassination irrelevant to the current case. Judge Aldrich allowed most of it, noting that pattern and motive could be relevant to understanding the plaintiff's claims. Mrs. Thornton, Morrison said during cross-examination, his voice dripping false sympathy, you're clearly bitter about losing your ranch. Isn't this testimony more about revenge against my client than about the Whitfield claim? Margaret's smile was cold. I'm bitter about injustice, Mr. Morrison. about a system that lets wealthy men exploit legal technicalities to steal from families who've earned their land through sweat and blood. If that makes me biased, so be it, but it doesn't make me wrong. Then Webb called Ben to the stand. Claire's brother walked to the witness box with his head high, wearing the one good shirt they owned, looking young and terrified and determined all at once. Webb's questions were gentle, designed to let Ben tell their story. He described their parents, the homestead, the work they'd all done. He talked about the winter after their deaths, how Clara had held them together, kept them fed, maintained the land even while grieving. His voice cracked when he described his father's funeral, steadied when he talked about his sister's strength. Morrison's cross-examination was brutal. Ben, how old are you? 14, sir. And you believe your sister can successfully operate a homestead alone? She already does. For 8 months. But long-term? Through droughts, hard winters, cattle disease? Your father struggled with all that, and he was a grown man with years of experience. My sister is stronger than you think. Strength isn't the question. Capability is. Do you really think a 20-year-old woman can handle the demands of frontier farming? Or are you perhaps blinded by loyalty to family? Ben's jaw tightened. I think my sister has already proven herself. And I think underestimating her is a mistake lots of people make right before she proves them wrong. A ripple of approval ran through the gallery. Even Judge Aldrich's stern expression softened slightly. Morrison moved on to Annie, who testified in a voice barely above a whisper about her garden, about helping Clara with cooking and cleaning, about their daily life on the homestead. She was young enough that Morrison's cross-examination was brief, conscious of how attacking a 10-year-old would appear to the court. Then Webb called Clara. She walked to the witness box, feeling every eye in the courtroom follow her. Her hands shook as she swore to tell the truth. She sat in the wooden chair and faced the packed gallery, the judge's stern scrutiny, Morrison's calculating assessment, and tried to remember everything Webb had coached. Webb started with her childhood, letting her paint a picture of growing up on the homestead, learning from her parents, working alongside them. Then he walked her through their deaths, the winter that followed, her choices and challenges. Miss Whitfield, why didn't you complete the patent process after your father died? Clara took a breath, found her center. I didn't know I needed to. My father had filed the claim. I thought that meant the land was ours as long as we worked it. I was focused on survival, on keeping my siblings fed and warm, on doing the work my parents had started. She met the judge's eyes. I failed to understand the bureaucracy, but I never failed to do the work. Every day on that land, I was fulfilling what the homestead law asks of people, turning raw territory into a productive home. And if given the opportunity to complete the patent now, I'd do it tomorrow. I'd meet every requirement, provide every proof, satisfy every legal demand, not because I want charity or special treatment, but because that land is ours. We've earned it. We've paid for it with 4 years of my father's labor, 8 months of mine, and blood and grief and determination most people never have to muster. Webb nodded, let the words settle, then turned to Morrison. Your witness. Morrison stood slowly, gathering papers, letting tension build. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost kind, which made it more dangerous. Miss Whitfield, I'm sorry for your losses, truly, but sympathy doesn't change the law. I'm not asking for sympathy, I'm asking for justice. Justice would be following the law as written. The homestead law requires 5 years of continuous occupation by the claimant. Your father didn't complete that requirement. You're not the original claimant. By what legal theory should you be granted this patent? By the theory that the law exists to encourage settlement and reward work, not to punish families for tragedy. My father would have completed the 5 years if he'd lived. I've continued his work for 8 months. Together, we've exceeded the time requirement. Denying the claim because death interrupted it isn't enforcing the law, it's using the law as a weapon. Morrison's expression hardened. Are you saying my client is using the law as a weapon? I'm saying Victor Hale has spent 30 years finding legal excuses to take land from people who can't fight back. I'm saying he saw our vulnerability and decided to exploit it. That's not legitimate land claim. That's opportunism dressed up in legal language. Objection, Morrison said sharply. The witness is making accusations without foundation. Sustained, Judge Aldrich said. Miss Whitfield, confine your testimony to facts. not characterizations. Clara nodded, but she'd made her point. She saw it in the judge's expression, in the way spectators leaned forward, in Morrison's barely concealed irritation. Morrison tried different angles, questioning her farming knowledge, her financial stability, her ability to complete the patent if granted the opportunity. Clara answered each question directly, refusing to be rattled, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Finally, Morrison played his last card. Miss Whitfield, isn't it true that Ethan Hale has been visiting your homestead regularly, working on your property, providing supplies and assistance? Clara's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. Ethan has helped us, yes. He's helped you. The son of the man you're accusing of opportunism. Don't you find that convenient? I find it honorable. Ethan saw what his father was trying to do and chose to stand against it. That takes more courage than anything I've done. Or perhaps he's been manipulated. Perhaps a young, attractive woman facing impossible circumstances found a way to turn the plaintiff's own son against him. The implication was clear, ugly. Clara felt heat rise in her face, anger cutting through fear. I have never manipulated anyone. Ethan made his own choices based on what he saw was right. If you're suggesting, I'm suggesting that emotional entanglements might cloud judgment, that Mr. Hale's testimony, which we'll hear shortly, might be motivated by personal feelings rather than objective truth. Then you're suggesting Ethan Hale is a fool who can't think for himself. Maybe you should ask him directly instead of attacking me. The gallery murmured appreciation for Clara's backbone. Morrison's lips thinned, but he nodded. No further questions. Clara stepped down on shaking legs. Webb caught her arm, steadied her. You did well, he murmured. Very well. But the hardest part was coming. Webb stood and spoke the words that would change everything. Your Honor, the defense calls Ethan Hale. The courtroom fell silent as Ethan walked to the witness box. Every eye followed him. This was the moment everyone had come to see. A Hale testifying against a Hale. A son betraying his father's empire. Ethan took the oath with his hand steady on the Bible, his voice clear. Then he sat and faced his father across the courtroom, and Clara saw 30 years of history compressed into that single locked gaze. This was the climax they'd been building toward. Whatever happened next would determine everything. Webb approached the witness box with the careful precision of a man handling dynamite. Ethan sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the wooden rail, his eyes never leaving his father's face. Victor Hale stared back with an expression carved from stone, but Clara caught the muscle twitching in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip on his armrest. This wasn't just testimony to him. This was betrayal. Mr. Hale, Webb began quietly, please state your relationship to the plaintiff in this case. Victor Hale is my father. I'm his only son, and, until recently, his presumed heir to the Hale Cattle Company. Until recently. What changed? Ethan's voice remained steady, but Clara heard the weight beneath it. I learned what kind of empire I was inheriting. I learned the cost of every acre we own, measured not in dollars but in families displaced, homes lost, lives destroyed by legal maneuvering disguised as legitimate business. Morrison was on his feet instantly. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is editorializing, not providing factual testimony. I'll allow it, Judge Aldrich said. This witness's motivations are central to assessing his credibility. Continue, Mr. Hale. Webb nodded. When did you first learn about your father's claim on the Whitfield homestead? 3 weeks ago. I overheard my father discussing strategy with his lawyers. He was pleased with himself, said the Whitfield claim would be the easiest acquisition of the year. Young orphans, incomplete patent, no resources to fight. He called them low-hanging fruit. The courtroom stirred. Clara saw several spectators lean forward, saw the judge's expression shift from neutral to attentive. What did you do after hearing this? I rode out to see the Whitfield homestead myself. I wanted to understand what my father was taking, what these people had built. Ethan's gaze found Clara in the gallery, held for just a moment before returning to Webb. What I found was a family working harder than anyone I'd known. 3 children who'd lost both parents but refused to abandon their home. A young woman carrying responsibilities that would break most people. Yet she stood in her doorway and told me to get off her land with more courage than I'd ever mustered in my privileged life. And that's when you decided to help them? That's when I decided I couldn't be complicit anymore. That watching my father destroy one more family was one family too many. Ethan's voice hardened. I've spent my entire life benefiting from my father's ruthlessness. I've lived in a house built with money earned from taking land from people like the Whitfields. I've eaten food bought with their loss. I've told myself that business is business, that the law is the law, that sentiment has no place in empire building. But the Whitfields made me see what I'd been refusing to acknowledge, that my father's empire is built on theft, and I've been his accomplice simply by accepting my inheritance without question. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every eye on Ethan as he laid bare his conscience for strangers to judge. Webb let the moment breathe, then continued. Mr. Hale, you've examined your father's legal strategy for this case. In your assessment, does he have a legitimate claim to the Whitfield homestead? He has a technical claim based on the letter of the homestead law. But legitimate? No. The Whitfields have occupied that land continuously for 4 years and 8 months. They've cleared fields, built structures, maintained livestock, improved the property in every way the homestead law was designed to measure. My father isn't claiming abandoned land. He's exploiting a technicality created by James Whitfield's death to seize property that by any reasonable standard belongs to the family who's earned it through work and sacrifice. Objection, Morrison called. The witness isn't qualified to make legal determinations about claim legitimacy. Your Honor, Mr. Hale has worked in land acquisition for Hale Cattle Company for 7 years, Webb countered. He's intimately familiar with homestead law and how it's applied in practice. His assessment carries weight. I'll allow the testimony, Aldrich said. The witness may continue. Webb turned back to Ethan. Tell the court what you observed during your visits to the Whitfield property. Ethan spoke with the precision of someone who'd memorized every detail. The cabin is solidly built, well-maintained. The barn shows recent repairs, new hinges on the door, reinforced support beams, fresh tar paper on the roof. The fields are properly fenced with markers indicating clear boundary awareness. The root cellar contains preserved vegetables from their autumn harvest. The chicken coop is weatherproofed and predator-resistant. Every structure shows evidence of ongoing maintenance and improvement. And the occupants? Clara Whitfield runs that homestead with more competence than most men twice her age. She manages livestock, maintains equipment, handles finances, educates her siblings. Ben, at 14, does the work of a grown man, hunting, hauling firewood, repairing fences. Annie tends a garden that feeds the family through winter. Even Samuel, at 6, has chores and responsibilities. They're not squatters playing at homesteading. They're a functioning family unit working productive land. Webb paused, let the description settle. Mr. Hale, I need to ask you something difficult. Your testimony here today will likely destroy your relationship with your father. You'll be disinherited, cut off from the family fortune, possibly ostracized by the entire ranching community. Why are you doing this? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. My mother died when I was 12. Before she passed, she made me promise that I'd choose to be a good man rather than a successful one, if those things ever came into conflict. She said land only matters if you can look in the mirror and respect who you see looking back. He finally looked at his father again, held that furious gaze without flinching. I haven't been able to do that for a long time. But standing here, telling the truth about what the Whitfields have earned and what my father is trying to steal, for the first time in years, I can. The courtroom was so quiet, Clara could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind the judge's bench. She watched Ethan sitting alone in the witness box, isolated from his father's wealth and fury, and felt something crack open in her chest, admiration and gratitude, and something deeper she didn't have words for. No further questions, Webb said quietly. Morrison rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate precision. He approached Ethan like a hunter circling wounded prey, and Clara's hands clenched in her lap. Mr. Hale, that was quite a performance. Very moving, but let's discuss facts rather than sentiment. Morrison's voice was silk over steel. You've known Miss Whitfield for how long? 3 weeks? 3 weeks. And in that time, you visited her property how many times? 6 or 7 times. During which you've worked alongside the family, shared meals, spent considerable time in Miss Whitfield's company. Would you say you've developed personal feelings for her? Ethan didn't hesitate. I respect her enormously. That's not what I asked. Have you developed romantic feelings for Clara Whitfield? The question hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt heat rise in her face, felt every eye in the courtroom turn to gauge her reaction. Ethan met Morrison's gaze directly. My personal feelings don't change the facts of this case. The Whitfields have maintained that land through continuous occupation and improvement. Whether I admire Clara Whitfield as a person doesn't alter whether her family deserves to keep their home. You're evading the question. Do you have romantic feelings for the defendant? Objection, Webb called. Relevance. Your Honor, the witness's objectivity is central to assessing his testimony. If he's emotionally compromised, romantically involved with Miss Whitfield, his testimony can't be considered reliable. Judge Aldrich considered, then nodded. I'll allow it. Mr. Hale, please answer the question. Ethan was silent for 3 heartbeats. 4. Clara held her breath, terrified of what he might say, what admission might undermine everything they'd built. I have the deepest respect and admiration for Clara Whitfield, Ethan said finally, his voice steady. Whether that constitutes romantic feeling or simply recognition of extraordinary character in the face of impossible circumstances, I honestly can't say. What I can say with certainty is that my testimony here is based on observable facts, not emotional bias. I've documented every improvement on that property. I've witnessed the work this family does daily. My assessment of their homestead claim rests on evidence, not sentiment. Very diplomatic. Morrison's smile was thin. Let me ask this differently. Has Miss Whitfield encouraged your testimony? Asked you to betray your father? Perhaps suggested that standing with her might lead to personal rewards? The insinuation was clear, ugly. Clara started to rise, but Webb's hand on her shoulder pressed her back down. Ethan's voice went cold. Clara Whitfield has never asked me for anything except to leave her family alone. When I offered to help, she refused. When I insisted, she made clear that any assistance came with no obligations, no expectations, no promises. She's the most fiercely independent person I've ever met, and your suggestion that she'd manipulate anyone is both insulting and completely counter to her character. Character you've assessed in 3 weeks. Character that's evident in every choice she makes, in how she's raised her siblings through grief, in how she's maintained a homestead through impossible circumstances, and how she told a Hale to leave her property despite knowing we could destroy her legally. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Mr. Morrison, I know you're trying to discredit my testimony by suggesting I'm some lovesick fool. But here's what you're missing. Even if I'd never met Clara Whitfield, even if I had no personal connection to this case whatsoever, the facts would remain the same. The Whitfields have earned this land. My father is trying to take it through legal technicality. That's not justice. That's theft. Morrison's composure cracked slightly. Your father built an empire that employs hundreds of people, that feeds thousands of head of cattle, that contributes enormously to Montana's economy. You're calling him a thief? I'm calling what he's doing to the Whitfields theft. I'm sure he's done legitimate business too. But taking land from orphaned children because their father died 5 months too soon. Yes, Mr. Morrison, I'm calling that theft. You ungrateful... Morrison caught himself, visibly regained control. Let me ask you this. When your father disinherits you, when you have nothing, where will you go? What will you do? I'll find work. I'll build something of my own. I'll live with the knowledge that I chose integrity over inheritance. Ethan's voice softened slightly. My mother left me a small trust fund separate from my father's estate. It's not much, but it's enough to start over. I'll be fine. And if the Whitfields lose this case despite your testimony, if your sacrifice accomplishes nothing, then at least I'll have tried. At least I'll have stood for what's right instead of what's easy. That's worth more than all my father's land. Morrison studied him for a long moment, seemed to realize he was only strengthening Ethan's credibility with every question. No further questions. Ethan stepped down from the witness box. As he walked past his father's table, Victor Hale spoke quietly, but the courtroom's acoustics carried his words to everyone present. "You're no son of mine." Ethan stopped, turned to face his father. "No, sir. I'm my mother's son, and I'm proud of that." He kept walking, took a seat in the gallery several rows behind Clara. She wanted to turn around, to meet his eyes, to somehow convey what his testimony had meant. But the trial was still in motion, and Webb was already calling his final witness. Harold Peterson took the stand and provided the technical foundation for their case: filing dates, improvement records, every documented interaction between the Whitfields and the land office. His testimony was dry, but essential, establishing that Clara had been actively seeking guidance on completing the patent, that she'd been trying to navigate the legal requirements rather than ignoring them. Then Morrison called his rebuttal witness, a rancher named Sullivan, who testified that he'd offered to buy the Whitfield homestead after James Whitfield's death, suggesting Clara had considered abandoning the claim. "I made her a fair offer," Sullivan said. "Told her it might be easier to sell, take the money, start fresh somewhere less demanding." "And what did Miss Whitfield say?" Morrison asked. "She refused, said the land wasn't for sale at any price." Webb smiled during cross-examination. So Miss Whitfield, faced with an opportunity to escape her responsibilities, to take money and run, she refused and chose to stay on the homestead instead? "Well, yes, but—" "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. That actually supports our case perfectly." The testimony concluded as afternoon light began to fade. Judge Aldrich reviewed his notes, the scratch of his pen loud in the silent courtroom. "I've heard extensive testimony from both sides," he said finally. "This case presents a difficult question, whether the letter of the law should override its spirit when circumstances create technical violations through tragedy rather than negligence. I'm not prepared to rule immediately. I'll take this matter under advisement and issue a written decision within 3 days." The gavel fell, sharp and final. The courtroom erupted in conversation, spectators filing out in clusters, discussing what they'd witnessed. Clara sat frozen, trying to process that it was over. The testimony, the arguments, the chance to fight. Now there was only waiting. Webb touched her shoulder. 3 days? That's actually good. It means he's taking this seriously, weighing both sides carefully. If he'd ruled immediately for Hale, we'd know we'd lost. But we might still lose. We might. But Clara, you did everything you could. You told your truth with courage and dignity. Whatever happens now, you can hold your head high. Clara nodded numbly. Her siblings surrounded her, Ben gripping her hand, Annie pressing against her side. Margaret Thornton appeared, offering quiet encouragement. People Clara barely knew stopped to shake her hand, to tell her they'd been moved by her testimony, that they hoped she'd win. Then the crowd parted and Victor Hale stood before her. Up close, he was older than Clara expected, lines deep around his eyes and mouth. But those eyes were sharp, calculating, utterly devoid of warmth. "Miss Whitfield," his voice was cultured, controlled. "That was quite a show your lawyer put on, quite emotional. It was the truth. Perhaps, but truth and law aren't always aligned." He glanced past her to where Ethan stood near the back of the courtroom. "My son seems to think choosing truth over law makes him noble. I think it makes him a fool." "Then you've raised a fool with more honor than you'll ever possess." Hale's expression hardened. "Careful, girl. The judge hasn't ruled yet. It's unwise to antagonize someone who might still own your land in 3 days. You'll never own it, even if you steal it legally, even if the court gives you the deed. You'll never own what my family built there. You'll just be another thief with a piece of paper." For a moment, something flickered in Hale's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or grudging respect for defiance. Then the mask of cold control descended again. "We'll see what the court decides. Good day, Miss Whitfield." He walked away, Morrison and his other lawyers trailing like well-dressed vultures. Clara watched him go and felt the full weight of the past 3 weeks crash down on her shoulders. She'd fought as hard as she could, but Victor Hale had fought harder battles and always won. Why should this time be different? "Clara," Ethan's voice quiet behind her. She turned to find him standing close, his expression open and uncertain in a way she'd never seen. "Can we talk? Outside?" She nodded, followed him out of the courthouse into cold evening air that bit through her borrowed dress. Helena's streets were busy with people heading home, lights flickering on in windows. the normal rhythm of life continuing while Clara's entire world hung in balance. They walked in silence to a small park, benches overlooking the city lights. Ethan sat, waited for Clara to join him before speaking. "I meant what I said in there. About respecting you. About—" He stopped, started again. "Morrison was right about one thing. I do have feelings for you. I have from the moment you told me to get off your land with a rifle in your hands and fire in your eyes. But I need you to know that's not why I testified. I'd have done this regardless, because it's right." Clara looked at her hands, cold and chapped from work. "I know. I've always known that. You're not your father, Ethan." "No. But I'm also not sure what I am now. I've burned every bridge, severed every connection. When we leave Helena, I don't have a home to go back to. You could stay in Bitterroot Junction. There's work for men willing to labor. You've proven you can build, repair, handle livestock. And be close to you." The words hung between them, honest and terrifying. Clara felt her heart hammering, felt the weight of everything unspoken pressing against her ribs. "Ethan, if we lose this case, there's no close to me. We'll have to leave, find somewhere else to start over. I can't—" Her voice broke. "I can't think about feelings or futures or anything beyond the next 3 days. I can't let myself hope for more than survival." "I understand." He reached out slowly, gave her time to pull away, then took her hand in his. His palm was warm, calloused, steady. "But when this is over, when the judge rules and we know what comes next, can we talk then? About what might be possible?" Clara wanted to say no, wanted to protect herself from one more thing that could be lost. But she'd learned over the past 3 weeks that protecting yourself from loss meant protecting yourself from living, and she was tired of just surviving. "Yes," she whispered. "When this is over, we'll talk." They sat in silence as darkness deepened, hands linked, watching Helena's lights bloom against the night. Whatever the judge decided, whatever came next, they'd face it. That would have to be enough. The 3 days passed in agonizing slowness. Webb insisted they stay in Helena rather than make the long journey home and back, so they waited in the modest hotel, time stretching and contracting unpredictably. Clara couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the impending decision that would determine everything. Ben tried to distract her with card games. Annie read aloud from the books they'd brought. Samuel asked endless questions about what would happen next, questions Clara couldn't answer because she didn't know. Margaret stopped by each evening with food and quiet company, her presence steadying without demanding conversation. Ethan kept his distance, respecting Clara's need for space but making sure she knew he was close if needed. She'd see him in the hotel lobby or walking past their window, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone in this waiting. On the 3rd day, a messenger arrived at noon with a summons to the courthouse at 2 o'clock. Judge Aldrich had reached his decision. Clara dressed in her borrowed clothes with shaking hands. Annie helped with her hair, fingers gentle as they pinned it up. Ben stood guard at the door, his young face set with determination. Samuel clutched his wooden horse, the one Ethan had carved, like a talisman against bad news. The walk to the courthouse felt endless and too short simultaneously. The building loomed against gray sky, its brick facade imposing and indifferent. Clara climbed the steps with Webb beside her, her family following, and wondered if she'd descend them still having a home or facing displacement into winter with nowhere to go. The courtroom was less crowded than during the hearing, just the principals, their lawyers, and a handful of spectators who'd followed the case. Clara took her seat, felt the wood hard beneath her, and fixed her eyes on the judge's empty bench. Judge Aldrich entered precisely at 2, his expression giving nothing away. He settled into his chair, adjusted papers with methodical precision, and looked out over the assembled group. "I've given this case considerable thought," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The law, as Mr. Morrison correctly notes, requires 5 years of continuous occupation and improvement by the original claimant to complete a homestead patent. James Whitfield died before fulfilling this requirement. Technically, legally, his claim ended with his death." Clara's heart sank. She felt Ben's hand find hers, grip tight. "However," Aldrich continued, and Clara's breath caught, "the homestead law exists to encourage settlement and reward labor. Its purpose is to transform public land into productive private property through the sweat and dedication of American families. The Whitfield family has undeniably fulfilled this purpose. 4 years of James Whitfield's work, followed by 8 months of Clara Whitfield's stewardship, demonstrate continuous occupation and improvement. The land has not been abandoned, it has been vigorously maintained and enhanced. The judge paused, looked directly at Clara. Miss Whitfield, your father's death created a technical violation of the 5-year requirement, but it did not create abandonment, neglect, or failure to improve the property. You have continued his work with remarkable dedication despite circumstances that would have defeated most people twice your age. The question before this court is whether the law should punish families for tragedy, or whether it should recognize that the spirit of the Homestead Law has been fulfilled even when its letter was interrupted by death. Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't move, suspended between hope and devastation. I find that the spirit of the law has been fulfilled, that the Whitfield family has earned their homestead through labor and sacrifice, that denying their claim based solely on James Whitfield's untimely death would violate the fundamental purpose of the Homestead Law. Aldrich's voice strengthened. Therefore, I rule in favor of the defendants. Clara Whitfield is granted the right to complete the homestead patent in her own name, with credit given for the 4 years of her father's occupation and improvement. Upon completion of the required documentation and payment of standard fees, the land will be legally transferred to Miss Whitfield and her siblings. The words took a moment to penetrate. Then they crashed over Clara like a wave. We won, we won, we won. And she was on her feet without remembering standing, tears streaming down her face, as Ben shouted and Annie grabbed her hand and Samuel jumped up and down, asking what happened, what happened. Furthermore, Aldrich continued, raising his voice over the commotion, I find that Victor Hale's claim to this property was opportunistic rather than legitimate, an attempt to exploit legal technicality rather than assert genuine right. His claim is dismissed with prejudice. This case is closed. The gavel fell with finality. Clara turned to Webb, who was grinning wider than she'd ever seen. We won, she whispered, testing the words. We actually won. You won, Webb corrected. Your testimony, your family's courage, your refusal to surrender, that's what won this case. Margaret appeared, pulling Clara into a fierce embrace. Your parents would be so proud, so very proud. Then Clara's siblings were surrounding her, all of them crying and laughing simultaneously, and she held them close and let herself believe it was real. They had their home. They had their land. They had survived Victor Hale's attempt to take everything, and they'd won. Across the courtroom, Victor Hale stood with his lawyers, his face carved from granite. Morrison was speaking urgently, probably about appeals, but Hale wasn't listening. He was staring at his son, who stood near the back of the room watching the Whitfields celebrate their victory. The look Hale gave Ethan was pure fury and something that might have been grief, if men like Victor Hale allowed themselves to grieve. Then he turned and walked out of the courtroom, his lawyers scrambling to follow, leaving his son behind without a word. Ethan stood alone near the courtroom doors, watching his father's retreating form disappear down the hallway. The finality of that departure settled over him like snow, cold, silent, complete. 25 years of being Victor Hale's son had ended with a turned back and unspoken exile. He should have felt something sharp, grief, maybe, or regret. Instead, there was only a strange lightness, as if he'd been carrying weight so long he'd forgotten what freedom felt like. Ethan. Claire's voice pulled him back. She stood a few feet away, her siblings clustered around her like planets orbiting the sun, all of them still tear-streaked and radiant with victory. Thank you for everything, for standing with us when it cost you everything. He shook his head. It didn't cost me everything. It cost me things that were never really mine, my father's approval, an inheritance built on other people's loss. What I gained was worth far more. What did you gain? Annie asked, her voice small and curious. Ethan smiled at the girl, thought about how to explain something he was only beginning to understand himself. I gained the knowledge that I can be better than I was raised to be, that choosing right over easy doesn't make you a fool, it makes you free. Ben stepped forward, extended his hand with the gravity of someone offering a sacred oath. You'll always be welcome on our land, Ethan Hale. Always. The handshake Ethan accepted felt like more than gratitude. It felt like belonging, like acceptance into something he'd never known he was searching for. A family that measured worth by character rather than cattle, by courage rather than capital. Webb approached with papers that needed Clara's signature, the beginning of the formal patent process that would legally secure their homestead. As Clara bent over the documents, her hands steady now, Ethan watched and felt the full weight of what they'd accomplished together. A family of orphaned children had defeated one of Montana's most powerful men. Truth had prevailed over technicality. Justice, for once, had sided with those who needed it most. The walk back to the hotel felt different than the walk to the courthouse had that morning. The same streets, the same buildings, but the world had fundamentally shifted. Clara moved through Helena with her head high, her siblings laughing and planning what they'd do when they got home. Margaret walked alongside them, sharing stories of her own legal victory years ago that had helped her rebuild after Hale took her ranch. "The difference is," Margaret said to Clara, "you won before he could take anything from you. You stopped him while you still had everything to fight for. That's rare. That's powerful." That evening, Webb treated them to dinner at Helena's finest restaurant, a place Clara would never have dared enter on her own. But Webb insisted, said victories should be celebrated properly, and before Clara could protest the expense, Margaret added that she was paying and wouldn't hear arguments. They ate roast beef and potatoes, fresh bread with butter, apple pie that made Samuel moan with happiness. Conversation flowed easily, plans for completing the patent paperwork, ideas for spring planting, Ben's hopes of expanding their livestock come summer. Normal things, future things, the kind of planning that assumed tomorrow would come and they'd be there to meet it. Ethan sat at the edge of the group, included but separate, and Clara caught herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. He'd sacrificed his entire inheritance for people he'd known less than a month. He'd stood against his father in open court, burned bridges that could never be rebuilt, and now sat eating pie with the family he'd saved while his own father wouldn't speak his name. After dinner, while Webb settled accounts with the hotel and Margaret took the younger children to see Helena's lights from a hilltop overlook, Clara found Ethan standing on the hotel's front porch, looking out at the city. "You're thinking about your father," she said quietly. "I'm thinking about my mother, actually, wondering what she'd say if she could see what happened today." Ethan's voice was soft, reflective. "I think she'd be proud. I think she'd tell me I finally kept the promise I made to her." Clara moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "What happens now, for you, I mean? Where will you go?" "I don't know. I have my mother's trust fund, enough to live on modestly while I figure out what comes next. I thought maybe I'd stay in Bitterroot Junction for a while. There's a small ranch for sale east of town, nothing grand but sufficient. I could start over, build something that's actually mine." "You'd stay?" Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. "If that would be all right with you. I know things are—" Ethan stopped, started again. "In the courtroom, Morrison asked if I had feelings for you. I deflected because it wasn't the time or place for that conversation. But Clara, the answer was yes. Is yes. I have feelings for you that go far beyond respect or admiration." Clara looked at him in the lamplight, this man who'd walked away from empire to stand with orphans, who'd chosen integrity over inheritance, who looked at her like she was brave instead of desperate. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted. "Everything's been survival and fighting and fear for so long I haven't had space to feel anything else. But when you testified today, when you stood up to your father for us, something shifted. I saw you not as Ethan Hale, the enemy's son, but as just Ethan. Someone I trust, someone I—" She paused, searching for words. "Someone I want to know better, if that's possible. If we can figure out what that means without the shadow of the trial hanging over us. I'd like that." Ethan's smile was tentative, hopeful. "I'd like that very much." They stood together in comfortable silence as Helena's night sounds rose around them, horses clopping past, distant piano music from a saloon, the murmur of conversation from hotel windows. Tomorrow they'd begin the journey home. Tomorrow they'd return to the land they'd fought for and start building whatever came next. But tonight, in this moment, Clara let herself imagine possibilities she'd been too afraid to consider before. Maybe home didn't have to be just land and family. Maybe it could also be the person standing beside you, choosing to stay when they could leave, seeing your worth when the world saw only struggle. The next morning brought clear skies and the long ride back to Bitterroot Junction. They traveled slower than they'd come. No urgency driving them forward now, just the steady rhythm of returning home victorious. Ben and Annie shared the wagon bench, arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to drive. Samuel slept in the back, exhausted from excitement and celebration. Margaret rode alongside for the first day, then branched off toward her own ranch with promises to visit soon. Ethan stayed with them the entire journey, and somewhere during those 2 days of travel, the awkwardness between him and Clara eased into something comfortable. They talked about small things, weather and crops, and the best way to reinforce fence posts. They talked about big things, what it meant to choose your own path, how to build a life from nothing, what kind of person you wanted to become when the world stopped telling you who you had to be. By the time they reached Bitterroot Junction, Clara had started to believe that maybe, possibly, there could be something between them worth exploring. Not now, not while everything was still raw and new, but eventually. When they'd both had time to settle into their changed lives, to figure out who they were without the trial defining them. The town greeted them like heroes. Word had spread fast about the court ruling, and people Clara barely knew stopped them on the street to offer congratulations. Peterson met them at the land office with paperwork already prepared, walking Clara through each form and requirement with patient thoroughness. "This is the easy part," he assured her. "You've done the hard work, proved your claim, won the case. Now it's just signatures and filing fees. 6 weeks from now, that land will legally be yours with documentation no one can challenge." 6 weeks felt like forever, and no time at all. Clara signed where Peterson indicated, paid the fees from the money Webb had returned after his conditional payment agreement ended with their victory, and walked out of the land office as the legal claimant to 160 acres of Montana territory. The homestead looked exactly as they'd left it, but somehow different too. Clara stood in front of the cabin that evening, her siblings already inside starting supper, and saw it with new eyes. This wasn't just the place where her parents had struggled and died. It was the place where she'd learned what she was capable of, where her family had proven they could survive anything, where they'd fought the most powerful man in the territory and won. "It looks good," Ethan said, riding up on his bay gelding. He'd gone to look at the ranch property he mentioned, the small place for sale east of town. "Feels like home, doesn't it?" "It always has, but now it feels like home that can't be taken away." Clara turned to face him. "Did you buy the ranch?" "I made an offer," the owner accepted. "I'll take possession in a month after the paperwork clears." Ethan dismounted, stood close enough that Clara could see the hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. "It's small, just 80 acres with a house that needs work and a barn that might fall down in the next strong wind. But it's mine, a place to build something honest. You'll be our neighbor, if that's all right." Clara thought about what it would mean to have Ethan nearby, to see him at town gatherings, to cross paths when buying supplies, to share fences and maybe help during harvest, to build something that started as gratitude and respect and grew into whatever it was meant to become. "More than all right," she said quietly. That winter passed in a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Clara completed the patent process with Peterson's guidance, each signed document bringing them closer to uncontestable ownership. Ben took on more responsibility with the livestock, proving he had their father's instinct for animal husbandry. Annie planned her spring garden with the intensity of a general plotting campaign. Samuel grew like a weed and lost his 2 front teeth, grinning gap-mouthed through every meal. Ethan bought his ranch and began the hard work of making it functional. He'd stop by the Whitfield homestead several times a week, sometimes to borrow tools, sometimes to help Ben with a project too big for one person, sometimes just to share supper and conversation. He never presumed more than friendship, never pushed for declarations Clara wasn't ready to make. He simply showed up, worked hard, and let his actions speak louder than words ever could. Clara watched him teach Samuel to whittle, saw him help Annie build raised beds for her garden, noticed how he and Ben had developed an easy camaraderie that looked like brotherhood. And she felt something growing in her chest, tender and terrifying. That might have been love, or might have been the possibility of love, given time and trust and the courage to risk one more thing she could lose. Spring came late that year, snow lingering into April before finally releasing its grip on the valley. But when it came, it arrived with a fury of green, grass pushing through thawed earth, wildflowers erupting across meadows, the cottonwood by her parents' graves leafing out in bright new growth. The patent papers arrived on a morning so beautiful it felt like blessing. Peterson rode out personally to deliver them, his face split with genuine happiness as he handed Clara the official documentation that made her the legal owner of Section 12, Township 8 North, Range 14 West. "It's done," he said simply. "The land is yours, legally and completely. Congratulations, Miss Whitfield." Clara held the papers with shaking hands, stared at her name written in official script, and felt 4 years of her father's work and 8 months of her own struggle compress into this single moment of victory. They'd done it. Despite everything, grief and poverty and Victor Hale's empire, they'd kept their home. That evening, Clara walked to her parents' graves beneath the cottonwood. Someone had been tending them. The stones were clean, wildflowers planted around the bases. Ben's work probably, or maybe all 3 of her siblings together. "We won," she said quietly to the earth that held her parents. "We kept the land. We kept the family together. We did everything you asked us to do, and we survived it." The wind moved through new leaves overhead, a sound like whispered approval. Clara stood until the light began to fail, then walked back to the cabin where lamplight glowed warm in windows, and her siblings were arguing cheerfully about whose turn it was to wash dishes. Home. Truly, legally, permanently home. A week later, Clara hosted a gathering to celebrate the patent and thank everyone who'd stood with them. Neighbors came from across the valley, bringing food and music and genuine happiness for the Whitfield family's victory. Margaret arrived early with a cake she'd baked herself, declaring that surviving Victor Hale deserved proper dessert. Webb sent a letter from Helena expressing his satisfaction with the outcome and his hope that Clara's victory would set precedent for future homestead cases involving claimant death. Ethan came as the sun was setting, carrying his guitar and wearing his best shirt. He'd cleaned up well, hair trimmed, beard shaped, looking less like a man who'd been working brutal hours to fix up a failing ranch, and more like the gentleman he'd been raised to be. "You look different," Samuel announced with his characteristic bluntness. "You look fancy. It's a special occasion. Your sister earned her land officially. That deserves fancy." Ethan caught Clara's eye across the gathering crowd, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, appreciation, and a question that had been building for months. The evening unfolded with the easy warmth of community celebrating one of their own. People ate too much. Children ran wild between the cabin and barn, and someone brought out a fiddle that paired perfectly with Ethan's guitar. Clara found herself dancing with Ben, with Peterson, with the neighbors who'd testified for them, or simply believed in their fight. Then Ethan appeared at her elbow as the music shifted to something slower, and asked without words if she'd dance with him. Clara took his hand and let him lead her into the space that had been cleared for dancing, aware of every eye watching them, but not caring. Let people talk. Let them speculate. She was dancing with a man who'd sacrificed everything to help her family keep their home. And if that led to questions about what might grow between them, those were questions she was finally ready to consider. "You're happy," Ethan said as they moved together, his voice low enough that only Clara could hear. "I am. For the first time in a year, I'm not afraid of tomorrow. Not waiting for the next disaster. Just," she searched for words, "just existing, planning, hoping. It feels strange. Strange good or strange bad? Strange wonderful." Clara looked up at him, at this man who'd become essential to her life so gradually she hadn't noticed until he was already woven into the fabric of everything that mattered. "Thank you. I don't think I've said that properly. Thank you for seeing us as people worth fighting for when everyone else saw just orphans in the way of an empire. Clara, you were never just anything. From the moment I met you, you've been extraordinary." Ethan's hand tightened slightly on her waist. "And I need to tell you something. I've been patient. I've kept my distance. I've tried to be just a friend and neighbor while you figured out your life. But I can't keep pretending that's all I want. I'm in love with you. I have been since you ordered me off your land with more courage than I'd ever seen. And if there's any chance you might feel the same, might be willing to see where this could go, I need to know." The music continued around them, but Clara had stopped hearing it. She saw only Ethan's face, open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen him, his heart laid bare for her to accept or destroy. I'm terrified, she admitted. I've lost everyone I've ever loved. My parents, the life I knew before they died, the certainty that tomorrow would be like today. Loving you means risking that kind of loss again. It does. But Clara, love isn't just risk, it's also possibility. It's building something together instead of alone. It's choosing to trust that some things, some people, are worth the fear. Ethan stopped dancing, held both her hands in his. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe, after everything we've been through, we deserve a chance at something good. Clara looked past him to where her siblings were watching, Ben with knowing eyes, Annie with barely contained excitement, Samuel with innocent curiosity. They'd survived by being careful, by not taking risks they couldn't afford. But they'd won their land by taking the biggest risk of all, by trusting a Hale when every instinct said not to. Maybe it was time to take one more risk. I can't promise I won't be difficult, Clara said slowly. I'm stubborn and independent and terrible at asking for help. I'll probably push you away when things get hard because that's what I do. I protect myself by keeping people at arm's length. I know. I've seen you do it for months. And you still want... Clara stopped, gathered courage. You still want to try? More than anything. The music swelled around them, fiddle and guitar weaving together in harmony. Clara stepped closer, let herself lean into Ethan's strength instead of standing alone, and felt something tight in her chest finally ease. Then yes, she whispered. Let's try. Let's see what might grow between us if we give it sunlight and time. Ethan's smile was brilliant, transforming his whole face. He pulled her close, and they danced the rest of the song wrapped in each other in possibility, while the community that had stood with them celebrated, and Clara's siblings cheered, and the Montana night spread stars overhead like blessings. Summer arrived in full force, bringing work that filled every daylight hour. Clara and her siblings worked their land while Ethan worked his, but they found ways to help each other. Clara lending Annie's garden expertise when Ethan tried to start his own vegetables, Ethan bringing his stronger back when Ben needed help moving stones to expand their barn, both families joining forces during harvest to bring in crops before weather turned. And in the spaces between work, something delicate and strong grew between Clara and Ethan. He courted her the old-fashioned way, Sunday dinners with her family, evening walks along the creek that bordered both properties, conversations that started about crops and weather but deepened into dreams and fears and the shape they wanted their futures to take. It wasn't always easy. Clara's independence chafed against the vulnerability that love required. She'd push him away when fear overwhelmed her, then have to swallow pride and apologize, explain that she was still learning how to let someone in. Ethan had his own struggles, guilt about his father, uncertainty about his new life, moments when he wondered if he'd made the right choice walking away from guaranteed wealth to build something from nothing. But they worked through it together, and slowly, carefully, Clara began to believe that maybe this was real, that maybe Ethan wouldn't leave, wouldn't die, wouldn't disappear the way everyone else had, that maybe she could have this, land and family and love, all at once. The anniversary of her parents' death arrived in early March, and Clara spent the morning alone at their graves, telling them about the year that had passed, how they'd kept the land, how Ben was becoming a man they'd be proud of, how Annie's garden had yielded enough to sell vegetables in town, how Samuel was learning to read from the books Ma had cherished, how Clara herself had found someone who saw her strength and loved her anyway. I think you'd like him, she told the stones that marked her parents' rest. I think Ma would say he has kind eyes, and Pa would say he works hard and treats me with respect. I think, her voice caught, I think you'd tell me it's okay to be happy, to build something new without forgetting what we lost. The wind moved through the cottonwood, and Clara chose to hear it as permission. That evening, Ethan came for dinner as he did most nights now, so familiar that Samuel called him to settle sibling disputes, and Annie asked his opinion on recipes, and Ben discussed livestock management like they were partners. After the meal, after the children had gone to bed, Clara and Ethan sat on the porch watching stars emerge. I've been thinking about something, Ethan said carefully, about the future, about what I want to build here. Your ranch is coming along well. The barn's solid now, and the house is almost livable. It's not about the ranch. It's about... He turned to face her fully. Clara, I know it hasn't been long. I know you need time, but I also know what I want, and I'm tired of pretending I don't. I want to marry you. I want to build a life together, combine our properties, raise children who grow up knowing they're loved and safe and home. I want to wake up every morning for the rest of my life and see you beside me. Clara's breath caught. Marriage. The word carried weight she wasn't sure she was ready for. Permanent commitment, binding herself to another person, risking everything on love. I'm not asking you to answer now, Ethan continued quickly. I just wanted you to know, to understand that this isn't casual for me, that when I think about my future, you're in every part of it. Clara stood, moved to the porch railing, looked out at land she'd fought to keep. Behind her, she felt Ethan waiting, patient as always, letting her process at her own speed. When I was 18, she said slowly, I thought I'd marry young like Ma did. Have a simple life, helping my husband farm, raising children, growing old in the same place I grew up. Then my parents died and I stopped thinking about marriage at all. Stopped thinking about anything except survival. She turned to face him. You're asking me to want more than survival again. To believe in futures and happiness and building instead of just defending. I am, but only if you want those things too. Only if you're ready. Was she ready? Clara examined the question honestly, looking past fear to what she actually wanted. She wanted the land secure, and it was. She wanted her siblings safe and thriving, and they were. She wanted to honor her parents' memory by living well rather than just surviving, and wasn't that exactly what Ethan was offering? Ask me again in 6 months, she said finally. Ask me when we've survived another winter together. When you've seen me at my worst and still want what you're describing. Ask me when I've had time to believe that good things can last, that I won't wake up one morning to find this was all temporary. Ethan stood, crossed to where she waited, took her hands in his. 6 months. I'll ask you properly, with a ring and witnesses and everything you deserve. And Clara? I already know the answer won't change. I've seen you at your worst. I saw you fighting Victor Hale with everything you had. I saw you terrified and stubborn and magnificent. Nothing the next 6 months reveals will change what I already know, that you're the woman I want beside me for the rest of my life. Those 6 months passed like water, swift and smooth, carrying them towards something Clara was beginning to believe in. Ethan's ranch became profitable enough to hire seasonal help. The Whitfield homestead expanded with new livestock Ben managed brilliantly. Annie's garden became legendary in Bitterroot Junction, people placing orders for her preserves and vegetables. Samuel started school and shocked everyone by being naturally gifted at mathematics. And Clara let herself be courted properly, let herself enjoy the small gestures Ethan offered, wildflowers left on her porch, help with difficult projects, quiet evenings where they talked about everything and nothing. She let herself imagine a future where she wasn't alone in making every decision, where partnership meant doubling strength rather than revealing weakness. When winter came again, softer than the brutal season before, Clara found herself actually looking forward to the cold months. No more fear of what they couldn't afford, no more wondering if they'd survive until spring. Just the peaceful rhythm of tending animals, planning for next year's crops, and evenings by the fire with her family and the man who'd become essential to all of them. On a clear February morning, with snow sparkling under brilliant sun, Ethan rode to the Whitfield homestead and asked to speak with Ben privately. They walked to the cottonwood tree together, and Clara watched from the cabin window, knowing what Ethan was asking. Permission, blessing, the approval of the man who'd stepped into their father's role when circumstances demanded it. When they returned to the cabin, Ben's grin told Clara everything she needed to know. That evening, with her siblings as witnesses, Ethan knelt in the cabin James Whitfield had built and asked Clara to marry him. He produced a simple gold band, nothing fancy but honest and solid, like the life he was offering. I promised to wait 6 months, he said. I've waited 7 just to be sure. Clara Whitfield, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life earning the gift of being your partner? Clara looked at her siblings, Ben nodding encouragement, Annie crying happy tears, Samuel bouncing with excitement. She looked at the cabin around them, the land visible through windows, everything they'd fought to keep. She looked at Ethan, patient and steady and completely, honestly hers. Yes, she said, and it was the easiest word she'd ever spoken. Yes, I'll marry you. The wedding took place in early April, just as spring was transforming the valley from brown to green. They married outside under the cottonwood tree where Clara's parents rested. The whole community of Bitterroot Junction gathered to witness. Margaret Thornton served as matron of honor, fierce and proud. Ben stood with Ethan, his young face solemn with the responsibility of giving his sister away. Annie and Samuel scattered wildflowers, making the ground bright with color. Peterson officiated, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd as he spoke about love and courage and building homes from nothing. Clara wore a dress Margaret had helped her make, simple white cotton with lace Ma had saved for special occasions. Ethan wore his best suit, looking nervous and happy and completely certain all at once. When Peterson asked if anyone objected to the union, a brief silence fell. Clara half expected Victor Hale to appear to make one final attempt at destroying his son's happiness. But the silence held peaceful, unbroken except by wind in new leaves and distant birdsong. They spoke their vows with the whole valley as witness, promises to honor and cherish, to build together instead of alone, to face whatever came with combined strength. When Ethan slipped the gold band on Clara's finger, it felt like the final piece of something falling into place. Not just a marriage, but a family made whole through choice rather than blood. The celebration lasted well into evening, food and music and dancing under stars that emerged one by one until the sky blazed with them. Clara danced with her husband, the words still strange and wonderful, and felt happier than she'd thought possible a year ago when everything seemed lost. As the party wound down and guests began departing, Clara found herself standing with Ethan at the edge of the gathering, watching their combined families mingle. Ben was teaching one of Ethan's ranch hands how to properly sharpen a knife. Annie was sharing gardening tips with Margaret. Samuel had fallen asleep against a tree, worn out from excitement. "Are you happy?" Ethan asked quietly. Clara considered the question honestly. A year ago, she'd been fighting for survival, terrified of losing everything, unable to imagine a future beyond the next court hearing. Now she stood on land that was legally hers, surrounded by family and community, married to a man who saw her strength and loved her for it rather than despite it. "I'm happy," she confirmed. "More than I thought I could be. More than I thought I deserved." "You deserve everything." Ethan pulled her close, and Clara let herself lean into his strength, finally understanding that accepting help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. "And I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." They stood together as the last guest departed, as Ben herded Annie and Samuel toward bed, as the valley settled into night quiet. Tomorrow, they'd begin their married life, combining households and properties, building something new from the foundation they'd both fought to secure. But tonight, Clara simply stood on land her father had claimed and her mother had loved, with the man who'd chosen her over empire, and let herself be happy. In the distance, a horse appeared on the road leading to their property. As it drew closer, Clara recognized the rider, and her breath caught. Victor Hale sat astride a gray stallion, alone, without lawyers or entourage. He stopped at the edge of their property, seemed to struggle with whether to approach further. Ethan stiffened beside Clara, his hand moving instinctively to protect her. But Clara touched his arm. "Wait, let's see." Victor dismounted slowly, like a man who'd aged years and months. He approached carefully, stopping several yards away, his proud bearing diminished by something that might have been regret. "I don't expect you to invite me closer," he said, his voice rough. "I don't expect welcome or forgiveness. He stopped, looked at his son. "I came to say I was wrong." The words fell into silence. Ethan said nothing, waiting. "I spent 30 years building an empire, and I told myself it mattered more than anything. More than honor, more than conscience, more than the son who questioned my methods." Victor's jaw tightened. "I was wrong. The day you testified against me, the day you chose principle over inheritance, I was furious. I felt betrayed. But these months since, I've had nothing but time to think about what I became, what I sacrificed to build something that turns out to mean nothing without someone to share it with." "What do you want?" Ethan's voice was carefully neutral. "Nothing. I want nothing except—" Victor looked at Clara, and she saw genuine contrition in his eyes. "I'm sorry. Miss Whitfield, I'm sorry for trying to take your home. You earned that land through work I never had to do, through sacrifice I never had to make. You deserve to keep it, and I deserve to lose the case. The judge was right to rule against me." Clara stared at the man who'd nearly destroyed her family, searching for manipulation or calculation. But all she saw was an old man who'd finally recognized the cost of his choices. "I accept your apology," she said quietly, "not because it changes what you tried to do, but because carrying anger forever hurts me more than it hurts you. You're forgiven, Mr. Hale. I hope that brings you some peace." Victor nodded slowly, then turned to his son. "Ethan, I don't expect you to come back. I don't expect to rebuild what I destroyed. But I wanted you to know I'm proud of you. You became the man your mother hoped you'd be, and I'm proud of that even though I fought against it. You're a better man than I ever was." Ethan stood rigid for a long moment, then took a step forward. "I can't forget what you tried to do to them. I can't pretend the last 30 years of your business practices were justified, but—" his voice softened slightly. "You're still my father. If you're genuinely trying to change, to be better, I won't shut that door completely. That's more than I deserve." Victor mounted his horse, looked down at them both. "I'll leave you to your celebration. But Ethan, if you ever need anything, I won't. I've learned to build things honestly, rather than taking what others have earned. But if you're offering relationship instead of money, if you're willing to be a father instead of an empire, maybe eventually we can find our way to something." Victor nodded once more, then rode away into darkness, leaving his son standing in lamplight with the family he'd chosen over blood. "Are you all right?" Clara asked quietly. Ethan watched his father disappear, then turned to her with something like wonder in his expression. "I am. I genuinely am. For the first time in my life, I have no idea what comes next, but I'm exactly where I want to be." Clara took his hand, laced their fingers together. "Then let's go home. Let's start building our life together." They walked toward the cabin where lamplight glowed warm in windows and family waited. Behind them, the cottonwood whispered in night wind, and Clara imagined her parents watching, approving, resting easier, knowing their daughter had not just survived, but thrived. She'd kept her family together. She'd defended their land. She'd found love in the unlikeliest place and built something stronger than fear or loss could shake. The land that had refused to let go had become the land she'd never release. And the home James and Elizabeth Whitfield had started would continue through their daughter and the man who'd proven that sometimes the best inheritance isn't what you're given, it's what you choose to build with your own hands and heart. Clara crossed the threshold of her cabin, her home, truly and forever, with her husband beside her and her future spreading out like the Montana sky, vast and full of stars, and absolutely finally hers.